It's a mother's worst nightmare. It begins just after 8:30 a.m. on March 25th, 2020, outside a gas station in Las Cruces, New Mexico.
Hello, this is 911. I'm working at the Chucky's in Doniana, and there's a man assaulting us. What's going on and where are you at? He was trying to take some kids. Can you come help, please? He threw the child on the ground. Was he trying to kidnap the children?
The woman has just stepped off a bus and is waiting for an Uber when a man suddenly grabs her 2-year-old right out of her arms.
He just walks up to her and yells at her, "Give me the kids."
Snatches one of her children and threatens to take the other ones. A horrifying, horrifying situation.
As the woman desperately fights to hold on to her children, who are only 1, 2, and 9 years old, employees and customers rush over to help. But the man goes after them too.
You see people trying to help her, and now they're being attacked.
He hit me. He hit the other employee. He just has been swinging at everybody.
It's total chaos. This man is not stopping, and the mother of the children he's trying to kidnap is trying her best to fight him off.
She's terrified for them. She's terrified for herself. She knows he's after those kids.
As numerous people dial 911 for help,
There's a man assaulting us.
they manage to usher the woman and her children inside the store. But the man races after them, violently trying to force his way in and viciously attacking anybody in his way.
So employees jump in, bystanders jump in. This guy is just crazy. It is pandemonium.
He's hitting everybody. He broke my fellow employee's glasses, punching her in the face.
The people that are inside the store are trying to body block the door and keep him out, but he just pounds and pounds his way through.
That's when things get really scary. The man finally does push his way through the door, then slings a series of punches at one of the people who is trying to help, until that man is forced to run for his safety. Now, the woman and her children are alone in the store with the angry attacker, and he's storming towards the back of the store. The petrified mother has locked herself in the bathroom with her children.
There's a crazy man trying to take my kids, and I have to run somewhere. I'm in the back. Hello? Okay, I can't understand you. I'm trying to get my kids. I'm in the back. Listen, try to grab my 2-year-old. Try to grab my son. Okay, you need to calm down for the baby, okay? It's okay.
She's locked herself in this bathroom with 3 crying babies. She's terrified. She's screaming. She's shaking. She doesn't know what to do.
She tells the 911 operator she has no idea who this man is or why he's after her. And there's something else.
I'm pregnant. Okay, ma'am. How far along are you? It's okay. Are you hurt? Do you need an ambulance? He punched me in the face really hard. It's okay. They're on the way. They're almost there, okay?
When you realize that on top of everything, she's also pregnant, it just rips at your guts.
Everyone is terrified. It seems like it's taking forever for the police to arrive.
Everybody's on their way, okay? Just stay on the line with me.
But now, the angry stranger is trying to break down the bathroom door. How much longer can this pregnant mother fend him off?
He was hell-bent on getting that woman and her kids. So now the worry starts to mount that he might be successful. Starts to really make you worry that he might actually be able to get a hold of her and her children.
But then, out of nowhere, a good Samaritan suddenly shows up to help. Who is he? And what is he here to do?
A man trying to kidnap a baby.
At a gas station in Las Cruces, New Mexico, a man is trying to steal a pregnant woman's children, fighting everyone who gets in his way.
He's after a lady with her kids. He's in the store. We can't get him out.
He's trying to force his way into the locked bathroom, where the terrified woman and her children are hiding.
There's a crazy man. It's okay. They're on the way. They're almost there, okay?
But then, a good Samaritan shows up out of nowhere.
This young man comes and goes after the attacker.
I knew that something was wrong. I didn't even think about it.
His name is Kanan Bauer, and incredibly, he's only 16 years old, and he's a district wrestling champion. When all the chaos begins, he's not even there. He's at another gas station.
I was about to get in my truck and leave when I heard someone screaming from across the street, a woman with a baby running away from this guy. Like, I just knew something was wrong, you know, that someone was screaming for help. So I flew across the street. There's a man holding the door, and he was all covered in blood. And the lady outside, she was screaming, he's gonna get the kids, he's gonna hurt the kids.
Kanan has no idea what he's walking into, but he doesn't hesitate.
And then he was trying to kick down the door so he could get to those kids where they were hiding. And so I grabbed him from behind.
In a matter of seconds, this 16-year-old wrestler overcomes a man nobody else has been able to stop.
It wasn't like a move that I did or practice. I just grabbed him from behind and pulled him down onto his back.
With their attacker now pinned to the ground, angry employees pile on top of him too. But Kanan calmly tells them to back off.
They were in my way. I wrestled and that I'm a big guy, so I trusted myself. I had him, and he wasn't going nowhere.
Kanan only had one brief moment of concern.
When I walked in the door and I saw that blood on the floor, I was worried that he had a knife or a gun on him. But as soon as I was like chest to chest with him, then I wasn't scared. So if he had a knife or something on him, I was too close for him to stab me.
Several minutes pass, and desperate employees are still pleading with the police to hurry up.
They're on their way. Everybody's on their way, okay? Just stay on the line with me.
Kanan stays firmly locked onto the man.
He was saying like, let me go and cussing and stuff. But after the first like minute, he gave up.
Kanan is calm, but the employees are still livid.
You see a lady come with a wet floor sign to hit him upside the head. You see someone try to hit him or kick him.
They were angry, and I could see why. But I was telling her to stop hitting him because he wasn't going anywhere.
After Kanan walks in, almost 6 long minutes go by.
And you're thinking, where are the cops? It feels like it's taking forever.
That's when the police roll up and quickly put the man in handcuffs. The store clerks and other witnesses shower their gratitude on the teen.
They were all very thankful and appreciative of what I did.
Police also praise Kanan for his remarkable bravery, but he modestly shrugs it all off. And after he talks to them, goes right back to his day.
I finished working on my truck. I had things to do, you know, I just carried on my day.
The man who tried to kidnap the children turns out to be 22-year-old Daniel Beltran Arroyo from Phoenix. Police don't know why he targeted the woman, but he's awaiting trial on charges of child abuse, attempted kidnapping, battery, and assault. The pregnant mother he attacked has requested privacy, but she and her children are recovering from the severe trauma of the incident. Meanwhile, the terrifying video of the attempted kidnapping and the 16-year-old wrestler who stopped it has gone viral.
He pinned a suspect to the ground until police arrived.
Proven himself as a crime fighter.
Kanan's parents are stunned, but say he's always been the kid who helps out.
He's just got a heart for people. He's got a heart for doing the right thing. Genuine would be the word I would describe him as. We've known this about Kanan since he was really in diapers.
He is like a giant teddy bear, 6'3" and 270 pounds. Solid muscle. He's a super compassionate kid.
The bravery and kind heart of this compassionate teen have touched people all over the world. He has received thousands of comments on social media. He's even gotten job offers. And for months, his mailbox was overflowing.
And a lot of people have sent us money. People have offered to buy him parts for his truck, gift certificates to restaurants, all kinds of stuff. And he just shakes his head and says, "Dad, that's not why I did it, though. I don't care if I get a penny off of it."
Still, there's one handwritten letter that touched Kanan deeply. It came with a $5 bill inside.
He opened up a letter, and he was sitting at the table crying. And I said, "Son, what's going on?" And he says, "Dad, this lady says you're an absolute American hero." And she said, "I wish I had enough money to take you out to dinner, but I've only got enough money to buy you an ice cream cone. This is the only money I've got, and I want you to have it."
Kanan says he's uncomfortable being called a hero, but his parents couldn't be prouder of him.
Kanan potentially saved a woman's life or her children's lives. That's a very awe-inspiring thing that he did. I I absolutely think he's a hero.
I'm incredibly proud of him. He ran into a situation that he had no business being a part of and saved the day. He wasn't doing it for any other reason other than it needed to be done.
And this brave teen says the only thing that matters to him is that he was in the right place at the right time, and those children didn't get kidnapped.
I'm just glad it worked out and I was there when I was. I always stuck up for myself and for the little guy. I think God put me there at that time for that reason.
Coming up, another dangerous scenario and another hero who steps in just in time.
Everything you got. It was the most terrified I've ever heard anyone in my life.
Everyone knows life can turn on a dime, and sometimes the cameras are rolling when it does.
Well, take a look at this frightening situation inside a cab.
Reading, Pennsylvania, March 7th, 2016. 4 p.m. A cab driver waits for a red light to turn green.
Cab driver going about his business, doing his daily job.
But this is a job that can be risky.
Driving a cab is a pretty dangerous business because you never know who is going to get into the back of your cab.
So in some cities, they call cab drivers walking ATMs. Why? Because they have a lot of cash. They pick up people, pick up strangers, so they're isolated.
And for this cab driver, an ordinary day changes in a terrifying instant.
Hey, give me all your money, man.
An armed robbery is underway in broad daylight.
Man, keep your hand where I can see him. I just started.
So this audio is terrifying. This man with the gun is using really aggressive tones. This is a cab driver's worst fear. He's terrified.
I need it now.
You can hear how fearful the cab driver is. He's scared for his life.
Voice is trembling. He starts using high-pitched octaves. I was really worried that this cab driver was just going to faint.
His life literally in the hands of a stranger. The driver is panicked, especially because he doesn't have much of the one thing the robber wants: money.
I need it all right now if you don't want to die, man.
Usually when people are accustomed to robbing from cab drivers, they get them at the end of a shift because they have more cash on hand. So this cab driver does not know what to do. He's thinking he is going to die if he does not give this guy cash.
Ralph Valletta had been driving a cab for over 25 years.
I had just started my day. I had no fares yet in the car.
Just minutes after picking up a young man, Ralph stops at an intersection for a red light. And that's when the young man in the back seat puts on a mask and pulls out a gun.
When I realized there was a weapon pointed at my head, my life flashed before me. It was probably the most scared I've ever been in my life, without question. I had $11. He started yelling, "I don't want to shoot you, but I will. Give me that wallet." He was very indignant that he wanted that wallet.
There's a loaded gun pointed at his head, and it could go off at any moment. But Ralph struggles to dig his wallet out of his pants.
He seemed to be annoyed when I was having difficulty getting my wallet out of my pocket. He was very aggravated. He thought that I was delaying, and he got very agitated at that point.
The seconds are ticking by, and the light has already changed from red to green and back to red, and the robber still has no money. Highly frustrated, his demands get bigger.
Then he started waving the gun and saying he wanted my cell phone. And I had just got a smartphone at that point. My father was in a assisted living facility, and this was my only communication with him. And I was hell-bent on not giving him that cell phone that day.
Please don't give me the phone. I need that.
I wanted it to end okay, and I didn't want to get hurt. You know, I didn't want to end my life in this spot at 10th and Buttonwood Street in the city of Reading.
Ralph finally gets his wallet out of his pocket. And that's when this story takes an incredible turn.
I noticed that there was a flashing light from a sheriff's deputy car behind me. And I said,
"There's a cop behind us. There's a cop behind us."
It seems like an almost unbelievable stroke of luck.
The police are literally sitting right behind the cab driver and this active robbery. And the officer jumps out and takes action.
But the situation may have become even more dangerous. The man approaching the vehicle is Deputy Sheriff Terry Ely and has no idea what he's walking into. 63-year-old Ralph Valletta has been driving a cab for a quarter of a century.
I took this job as a way to put a few dollars in my pocket until I found another sales job, and here I am now, 29 years later, still doing this. I like the fact that we're meeting different people and seeing different things every day. Driving is only about 10% of the job. 90% of the job is dealing with people, and that's what I enjoy every day.
But on the afternoon of March 7th, 2016, at an intersection in Reading, Pennsylvania, Ralph must deal with a potentially deadly situation.
A masked gunman demanding money.
I thought that this could possibly be the end of my life. When the gun was pointed at my head, I didn't know what his intentions were.
It all begins with the dispatch call for a routine pickup to bring a passenger to a local mall.
The address that I was given for the pickup was a routine address. The gentleman came out of the house. I didn't do what I normally do, and that's to make sure he came out of the exact address that I was given. Through experience, problems that I've had in the past, if someone is going to try to do something, they're not going to come out of the address that they have given you. And as we pulled away, he said to me, "I forgot my money. You have to take me back." So we got 3/4 of the way back to his house. I came to the intersection with a red light. I stopped, and he pulled out the gun, pointed it at my head, and announced that this was a robbery.
Hey, give me all your money, man.
When I realized there was a weapon pointed at my head, I was terrified.
But Ralph has had one stroke of almost unbelievable good luck. Right behind him is a police car. The officer inside has turned on his lights and is approaching the taxi.
There's a cop behind us. There's a cop behind us.
And Deputy Sheriff Terry Ely has been quietly watching for longer than Ralph or the armed robber realize.
I noticed a taxi cab double parked in the middle of the street in our city. I noticed the light has transferred from green back to red again, and the taxi cab hasn't moved. So at that point, I figure something's a little strange. I flick on my lights and I get out of my car.
So I would never advocate for anyone to commit a robbery. I would certainly not advocate to commit a robbery while the police are right behind you.
As Terry approaches the taxi, all his senses are on high alert.
The back window was open maybe about 2 inches, and I leaned down, put my fingers in the window and looked in the back window.
Let me see your hand here. Get out.
Once I looked in the window, he had a mask up over his nose and a hood up with money in his left hand, and I could see something black in his right.
What will the armed robber do? His only options seem to be surrender or shoot.
What's the crime? Let me see your hand here.
I fixed my firearm in him, told him to exit the vehicle.
Get out. 120. Get on the ground now. Oh my God.
Ely gets the armed robber on the ground in a matter of seconds.
Oh my God. You're a lifesaver. Oh my God. He has a gun. He had it at my head. He had a gun at my head.
I called for backup, and my backup arrived within 30 seconds, and he was taken into custody.
This could have gone wrong in so many ways. Had this perpetrator been spooked in one way or another, or felt that he needed to take this to a different level, the officer could have been harmed, the cab driver could have been harmed.
Ralph Valletta is so relieved, he jumps out of his cab and throws his arms around Terry.
Ralph was very shaken. He was visibly shaking, and when he hugged me, I could actually feel him shaking. And in his voice, the terror in his voice was very bad. It was just probably the most terrified I've ever heard anyone in my life. It really is. Ralph, he was calling me a lifesaver. He said I was his guardian angel, things like that. And I was like, wow, I was like, I really made a difference in someone's life here.
The would-be armed robber turns out to be 18-year-old Victor Martinez Herrera. He has no prior criminal record. He pleads guilty to robbery and is sentenced to 5 to 10 years in prison. For Ralph, the aftermath fills him with mixed emotions.
He turned out to be an 18-year-old high school student. I said a prayer for him that I hope that he changes his life, because at the age that he was when he committed this act, there was still plenty of time for him to lead a productive life.
Ralph and Terry have now become friends, and they both believe someone or something was looking out for him that morning.
I don't know if you believe in divine intervention or what it was, but something told him to do what he did that day.
I believe I was put there for a reason. We're supposed to be there to protect the people that can't protect themselves. I just did what I was trained to do.
Every job has got its inherent dangers. Driving a taxi does have some dangers, but I'm still doing it.
It's terrifying to watch.
You see the men punching the woman as they try to get her keys.
May 7th, 2016, 9:30 p.m. The west side of Atlanta. A woman pulls up to a gas station located just off I-20 on East Hamilton Holmes Drive. She goes into the convenience store unaware that trouble is following her, and the cameras are rolling. On her way out, the woman does a quick good deed.
She gives a homeless man who's outside the door of the convenience store some money.
Little does she know what awaits her around the corner.
She's approached by these two guys. They are armed, and they are demanding her car. They're robbing her. She's being robbed and carjacked.
An attempted robbery is underway. From inside, the terrified gas station attendant dials 911, unsure how many attackers there are.
We got 3-4 guys that robbed the people here. They have guns.
Outnumbered and unarmed, the woman faces her attackers as they steal her keys. But they don't know who they're dealing with.
She's not having it. She's not having any of it. And she is fighting them tooth and nail.
20 miles away in Marietta, Georgia, Billy Warren will soon catch the whole terrifying scene on his television.
My wife and I were getting ready to go to bed. And so the news comes on, it says, breaking news in Atlanta.
2 men with guns jumped a woman.
That woman is his 24-year-old daughter, Jasmine, his only child. And she is in a fight for her life. Billy watches the video in horror.
So many emotions run through your body so quickly that you say to yourself, oh my God, I can't believe this is happening.
So she was literally on her own and did quite well, by the way.
She's a tomboy. She loves weightlifting. She spends a good portion of her time running and in the gym, and she just goes for it.
Jasmine opens the driver's side car door and pulls one of the men out of her car. And things don't stop there. When the other man tries to rescue his accomplice, she goes after the gunman again.
This could have gone really, really wrong for her. These guys were armed with a gun. Why would you do that? Why would you put up such a fight over a car? A car could be replaced, but you cannot.
But then, events take an even more dangerous turn.
When he hit her with the gun, she said, okay, it's time for me to shift into a second gear. And then she begins to explode on him, and the other guy comes around to try to pull her off him. Then I'm saying, she's taking a stance. She knows what she's doing. She's made a decision.
Still, Jasmine's dad holds his breath in fear as he watches what happens next. Jasmine goes after the gunman again, but it's a very dangerous decision. The gunman and his accomplice try to drive away, but she still refuses to let them take her car.
She's fighting with these guys, and then the ignition key breaks off in the car, and they can no longer even take the car at this point.
In the midst of the chaos, a car has pulled up behind and seems to pause to watch the unfolding drama. Who's inside? Are they a part of this too? Or are they just too scared to get involved?
We've seen some other videos where Good Samaritans will jump in, but generally that is not the case. Their fear of being injured or maybe even killed, prevents them from going that extra step to try to help out the person who's being, assaulted right in front of them.
And now, Jasmine's attackers have become even more hostile and aggressive, punching her forcefully. Neither the store clerk or the homeless man Jasmine gave money to minutes earlier are anywhere to be seen.
None of these people chose to intervene to help this young lady out.
Incredibly, Jasmine comes at the gunman a fourth time. They struggle with the handgun, and as the car behind them pulls away, she finally decides to run. Her dad is in shock.
After I saw the gun, I said I could be in a situation where I'm putting my daughter in a casket, and no parent wants to bury their child.
And for Jasmine, it looks like there's no escape. She desperately tries to get inside the gas station, only to find that the door is locked.
My heart just dropped. I said, my kid is going to be killed.
At 9:30 p.m. on the night of May 7th, 2016, a 24-year-old woman is attacked by two men attempting to steal her car.
We got 3-4 guys that robbed the people here. They have guns.
No one's coming to help her. She is on her own against these two.
But the would-be carjackers didn't realize who they were up against, and Jasmine Warren wasn't about to go down without a fight.
It was Cinco de Mayo weekend, and a lot of my friends, they were coming back from college, so we were gonna go out.
Jasmine had stopped to buy some Tylenol on her way to a club in downtown Atlanta.
I walked out of the store, and I didn't see them. They, of course, saw me, and the one guy had the gun, and it just right then, like, hit me, like, oh my God, there's a gun in my face.
What should have been a fun night out has become a potentially deadly situation.
He just kept telling me to give me the keys, give me the keys. So I gave him the keys. But as soon as they got in the car and I'm looking at this whole entire thing happen in front of me, it dawned on me, like, I really don't want this to happen. It was like, no, you're not about to do this today, no.
Jasmine makes a quick, calculated assessment of her attackers and decides she can take a risk.
When I saw the movements, I was like, oh, these guys are amateurs. They don't know what they're doing.
That's when Jasmine, who worked as a youth counselor for the city of Atlanta, jumps into action.
They were kids and they were scared. I became like G.I. Jane in 2 minutes.
Still, Jasmine knows she's no match for a loaded firearm.
Yeah, he said to me, I'm gonna shoot you, I'm gonna shoot you. That last time when he cocked the gun, that was the moment where it hit me like, oh no. I didn't know what his intentions was, so I was like, okay, well, I'm just gonna run.
She makes a break for the convenience store door, but to her dismay, the door is locked.
The guy wasn't even trying to open the door. Like, at first I was having to yank it. He didn't want to open it. I'm like, open the door.
For a terrifying moment, Jasmine isn't sure what will happen next. But then, the gas station attendant, who knows police are on the way, finally relents.
Literally, he opened the door. I went in for 2 seconds and came back out because a police officer had pulled up.
To Jasmine's relief, the would-be carjackers have fled the scene, and she is finally safe. And that's when the gravity of it all really sinks in.
I was like, oh my God, I could have died. Oh my God, why did I do that? Like, the actual realization, like, this really just happened. Like, I really just did all of this within this moment of these kids about to take my car.
The first person Jasmine talks to is her father, Billy.
I rush to the phone. I call her. I'm like, Jay, where are you? Are you okay? And she says, Dad, I'm fine. I had a couple of guys that tried to take my car. And so I get up, I get dressed, and I drove to Atlanta. So it took me about 20 minutes to get to her.
For Billy, the most chilling part is how frighteningly close he came to losing his daughter.
I says, Jasmine, I need to understand something. You were faced with someone who had a gun in your face. Sweetie, what were you thinking fighting these guys?
And brave as her actions were, Jasmine knows she took a huge risk.
You guys, please do not do this. I could be 6 feet under, or I could be crippled, or I could be blind. I could be a lot of things right now, depending on if I would have got shot. I would definitely never do that again.
If these were more hardened criminals, seasoned criminals, so to speak, then it's possible that this could have gone even worse than what it was.
For Billy, it's too much to even think about, and his emotions are all over the place.
Yeah, I was proud that she reacted, I was not proud that she continued to scuffle, but then I guess I'm partially at blame because I've always taught her to stand up for what she thinks is right.
Police launch an intense search for Jasmine's attackers, but never find them. And surprisingly, years later, Jasmine says she isn't angry with them.
I was a youth counselor for the city of Atlanta, for the Atlanta Workforce Development Agency, so it helped me understand what other people have endured or deal with. I did forgive them.
And coming up, another dad witnesses potential harm to his daughter, so he sets up a sting operation to protect her.
I had to do what was right for my kid.
Thursday, June 22nd, 2017, Del City, Oklahoma, 12:52 a.m. A man in a baseball hat strolls into a backyard and unzips the door to a tent. What is he doing here?
It all looks pretty innocent at first. I mean, maybe it's just a dad checking on his kids, camping out at night. It looks totally normal and calm at first.
But it quickly becomes obvious to the homeowners that there is nothing innocent about this.
So this guy doesn't belong here. He doesn't live here.
It turns out that this is a 33-year-old man who has been communicating by text with the 15-year-old girl who lives in the home.
She told him that she was gonna be camping in her backyard that Friday and that he should come over.
Whatever the teen thinks is going to happen, the man has come here for only one very disturbing reason.
He came over to have sex in her backyard, a 15-year-old girl. It's just wrong. I mean, it's wrong.
It's all really sickening. And what this man doesn't know is that he's in for a big surprise. The dad has gotten wind of his plan, and he's decided to do something about it.
My dad was extremely irate, as he should be. I have two daughters that age, and I would feel the same way as he did. He was very, very upset.
The dad is so upset, he arranges an elaborate family sting operation.
The father puts together an ad hoc posse of individuals who are going to deal with this guy.
They had it all set up, and he didn't have a chance.
As the man leans down to unzip the tent, expecting to find the teen, he has no idea that her mom is the one waiting inside. And he never sees her dad and two other family members as they sneak up behind and tackle him.
He didn't see them, and they took him to the ground.
But now, what's going to happen? They don't know anything about this guy.
You got to think, if the suspect would have had a firearm, you just never know with people like that. You don't know what they're bringing to the table. You don't know what they have on them.
And with emotions running so high, what is the family going to do with him next?
One of the reasons why vigilantism can get pretty dangerous is you're dealing with the unknown. You're not a trained professional. Somebody can get very seriously hurt or killed. When emotion takes over and that desire to intervene and exact perhaps even a little bit of revenge, it can get very dangerous.
Especially when they find out the shocking truth about just who this guy really is. When a 33-year-old man who's been sending sexually inappropriate texts to a 15-year-old girl shows up at her home for what he thinks is going to be a rendezvous, he's stunned when he's greeted by her dad instead.
His eyes were so wide that they looked like saucers. He just kind of went sheet white. It looked like he had just seen a ghost.
The ordeal begins when Fred Morano notices his daughter huddled secretly in a corner with her phone and has a gut instinct that something isn't right.
I'm a pretty protective dad. So I walk over, she didn't know I was there, and snagged her phone out of her hand. Very first thing I saw was send me a picture. My blood started boiling. There was a lot of lewd, very lewd comments that you don't make to a 15-year-old girl.
And it gets worse. He quickly learns the lewd texter is almost 20 years older than his teenager.
And I researched him through Facebook. My heart sunk. I can't comprehend. I mean, I'm 40, you know, to even look at a child. I was disgusted, and it just can't happen. Not in my house.
Fred also learns that the man has been communicating with his daughter on social media for almost a month. She knows how old he is, but they have exchanged suggestive photographs, and now he has convinced the teen to meet him in her backyard tent.
I asked her why. I said, why would you do this? She would never really give me a straight answer. She had a lot going on in her life. I didn't get my daughter until she was 11 years old. I didn't even know she existed until she was 9. So at that point in time, she still hadn't really come into her own. So she was kind of looking for that outreach.
Concerned for his daughter and furious, Fred goes straight to the police.
I said, well, you know, you can read these text messages. They're planning to meet in my backyard tonight. Be done. He's like, nothing can be done until he comes on your property. So we have cameras in our living room, we have cameras in our front porch, we have cameras in our driveway, cameras in our backyard. As a father, I had to do what was right. I wanted to make sure that this didn't happen to anybody else.
So that night, with his daughter hiding safely upstairs in her bedroom, Fred uses her phone to text the man, as if everything is still a go.
He texted close to the time that he was going to come over, and we did respond with, I'm waiting.
Fred corrals family members to help. One keeps watch out front, and the rest are hiding in the backyard.
We were stacked up by the back door. It was me, my nephew, and my cousin. My wife was in the tent with a baseball bat. You don't know what you're getting into. I was scared out of my mind.
Then, at 12:52 a.m., it's on. Oblivious to the cameras and what he's walking into, the man strolls into the yard and casually leans down to open the door of the tent. That's when they pounce.
So as soon as he hit that tent, he was down. He didn't have time to even think. We tackled him to the ground. We took zip ties and tied his feet together, and then we took zip ties and tied his hands together. You've stepped into the wrong backyard with the wrong set of people.
With the man restrained, the family calls police, who arrive within minutes and take the suspect, 33-year-old Jeremy Wilson, into custody. That's when the potential danger of the situation really sinks in. At one point, they even thought Wilson might have a gun.
Yeah, I was watching his hands. He's reaching. Wait, is he reaching? Nope. Okay, he's not reaching. It was a big sigh of relief once they had him on the ground, and at that point in time, it was just...
They protected their daughter, and they were lucky.
I don't even know how I would respond in a situation like that if it was my daughter. I can't blame them. I would probably do the same thing.
As the video of Wilson's shocking family-style takedown makes worldwide news,
father creating an elaborate sting. He was coming here and going to that tent
to catch a child predator.
Fred's actions are widely applauded.
Police say they don't condone vigilante justice, but say they're not filing any charges against the girl's family.
Before police take Wilson away in handcuffs, Fred grills him about why he dared to walk into his backyard in the first place.
A lot of it was just, I'm sorry. I was just here to talk to her, that he was there to help her. I didn't pay any attention to it. He was there to have sex with my daughter.
And when police interrogate Wilson and go through the texts he sent the 15-year-old girl, they are certain that he only came for one thing.
When he got there and he was in custody, he had a condom in his pocket. During their messages, he told her he would have to wear a condom. He asked her for pictures, naked pictures. He sent one of his genitals to her.
But this story has an even more disturbing twist. It turns out Wilson reached out to the girl on Facebook because he wanted to reconnect. Many years earlier, he'd been a friend of her mother's.
Jeremy used to change my daughter's diapers when she was a baby. He's a babysitter, take care of her.
This is just being a predator on a whole new level. You changed her diapers as a baby. You're almost 20 years older than her, and now you want to have sex with her? As a mother, this just makes my blood boil.
What makes a person do that.
Wilson never offers an answer, and as far as police can tell, has no remorse.
I think the only regret he had was that he got caught.
Wilson is charged with unlawful communication using technology and is sentenced to 10 years behind bars, but is now out on probation. As for Fred Morano, who had a stern talk with his 15-year-old following the incident, he says he would definitely do it all over again.
Talk to your kids. If they're silent for a reason. So talk to them. This is about protecting your kids. You've got to do what it takes to take care of your family.
The phone rang just after midnight, and by the time the sirens cut through the frozen air of January 1977, the snow along the Hudson River had already begun to swallow the footprints. A single street lamp flickered on the edge of a narrow road outside Albany, casting a sickly yellow glow over a sedan parked at an awkward angle, engine cold, driver's door half open, as if someone had stepped out and never looked back. Inside, the keys were still in the ignition. On the passenger seat, a wool coat neatly folded. On the floorboard, a handbag untouched. But the driver, 26-year-old schoolteacher Margaret Hale, was gone. By dawn, the whispers had begun. Missing. Vanished. No struggle. No blood. No note. Just a car abandoned in the quiet dark of upstate New York. The kind of story that crawls under the skin of a community and refuses to leave. Margaret had left her apartment at 10:14 p.m. after a late dinner with friends. She told them she was tired, that she had papers to grade, that she would call in the morning. She never did. The route home was familiar, barely 15 minutes, a straight shot past shuttered storefronts and snow-buried sidewalks. Police retraced it again and again. Nothing. No witnesses who saw her pulled over. No reports of a stalled vehicle. Just a car, silent and still, as if placed there deliberately. The headlines hit hard. Local teacher missing. Police baffled. Foul play suspected but unconfirmed. The town gathered in church basements, in diners thick with cigarette smoke, trading theories between sips of burnt coffee. Some said she'd run away. Others said she'd met someone in secret. But those who knew Margaret described a different woman, meticulous, cautious, devoted to routine. She locked her doors twice. She avoided shortcuts. She carried a small canister of mace in her purse. She did not simply disappear. Investigators combed the vehicle inch by inch. No fingerprints but her own, and a partial smudge too faint to identify. The gas tank was half full. The radio was off. Snow on the hood suggested it had been sitting for hours before discovery. But the road itself told a stranger story. Tire tracks showed she had pulled over willingly. There were no signs of another car forcing her off the road. No skid marks. No broken glass. Just a neat stop at the shoulder, like she had been expecting someone. Search parties fanned out across frozen fields and wooded patches nearby. Dogs caught a scent near the driver's door, followed it 20 yards toward the riverbank, then lost it completely, as if Margaret had dissolved into the winter air. Divers went into the black water days later. They found nothing but debris and ice. Weeks turned into months. Leads poured in and dried up just as quickly. A truck driver claimed he saw a woman arguing with a man near that stretch of road around 10:30 p.m., but he couldn't describe her face. A waitress swore she'd served Margaret coffee that same night at a roadside diner miles away. Impossible, according to the timeline. A psychic from Syracuse insisted Margaret was alive, held against her will in a white farmhouse. Police checked every white farmhouse within 50 miles. Nothing. The case grew colder with each passing winter. Margaret's photograph, dark hair, steady eyes, a slight, serious smile, hung in the police station lobby. Detectives aged. Chiefs retired. Files thickened with dust. The words "cold case" were eventually stamped across the folder in red ink, a bureaucratic surrender to time. But Albany never truly let it go. In 1983, 6 years after her disappearance, a construction crew unearthed a shallow grave 20 miles south of town. The remains belonged to another missing woman, a college student who vanished in 1981. The discovery reignited fear. Was there a predator moving through the region? Was Margaret his first victim? Investigators compared timelines, cross-checked suspects, re-interviewed witnesses. Nothing connected cleanly. Theories multiplied. Evidence did not. Margaret's parents held on to hope with a grip that bordered on defiance. They kept her bedroom untouched, her books aligned on the shelf, her winter boots by the door. Her mother insisted she heard footsteps some nights, soft and deliberate, like Margaret pacing the hallway. Grief settled over the family like a permanent snowfall, quiet, heavy, impossible to clear. By the 1990s, new technology promised fresh answers. DNA testing was advancing, transforming other stalled investigations into headline-grabbing breakthroughs. Detectives revisited the sedan, preserved in an evidence garage, sealed and forgotten. They re-examined fibers from the back seat, scrapings from beneath the door handles, hair strands caught in the upholstery. The results were maddening. Inconclusive, contaminated, too degraded to form a profile. Rumors shifted direction. A former co-worker of Margaret's came under scrutiny after a messy divorce revealed a temper he'd long concealed. He denied involvement, passed a polygraph, moved out of state. Years later, a convicted felon serving time for assault bragged to cellmates about abducting a teacher in the late 70s. Detectives flew out to question him. He recanted, admitted he'd fabricated the story for attention. Each false lead reopened wounds. Each dead end deepened the silence. Then came 2002. A retired detective, Thomas Keegan, decided he couldn't let the file rest. He had been a young officer on the night Margaret vanished, standing by that half-open car under the flickering street lamp. The image had followed him through his career like a shadow. In retirement, free from department politics and resource constraints, he began revisiting the case unofficially. He interviewed aging witnesses in their living rooms, flipping through yellowed notebooks, listening for inconsistencies time might have exposed. One detail began to bother him: the positioning of the coat on the passenger seat. It was folded, not tossed. If Margaret had stepped out briefly, to check the engine, to speak with someone, why remove her coat in the middle of a January night? Unless she never intended to return to the driver's seat. Unless she believed she was stepping into another vehicle for only a moment, somewhere warm. Keegan tracked down records of registered vehicles in the area in 1977, focusing on men with prior complaints, harassment, stalking, minor assaults. One name surfaced repeatedly in old incident reports: Daniel Mercer, a mechanic who owned a small garage less than 3 miles from where Margaret's car was found. In 1976, a woman had reported Mercer for following her home from a grocery store. No charges were filed. In 1978, another complaint, lewd comments, unwanted advances. Again, no prosecution. Mercer had never been interviewed in connection with Margaret's disappearance. When Keegan brought the name to current investigators, they hesitated. Mercer was now 72, a grandfather, a respected fixture at a local veterans hall. He had no violent convictions, no known ties to Margaret. But the absence of evidence was precisely what had defined the case for decades. They reopened the file quietly. Detectives canvassed Mercer's past, piecing together a timeline from faded receipts and employment records. On the night Margaret vanished, Mercer had closed his garage at 9:45 p.m. His home was in the opposite direction of the road where her car was found. No one could confirm his whereabouts between 10 and midnight. A search warrant was executed on his property in the fall of 2003. Officers combed through old tools, rusted car parts, boxes of letters in the attic. In a locked chest beneath a workbench, they discovered something that made the room go still: a collection of women's items, scarves, gloves, costume jewelry, none belonging to Mercer's wife. Among them, a thin gold bracelet engraved with the initials MH. Margaret Hale had received that bracelet as a graduation gift. Her mother had described it in interviews for years. Photographs confirmed it: delicate chain, tiny clasp, initials etched in looping script. Mercer claimed he found the bracelet in a junked vehicle brought into his shop decades earlier. He said he kept odd trinkets out of habit. He could not explain why it was locked away. Forensic testing revealed microscopic traces of fiber on the bracelet consistent with the upholstery from Margaret's sedan. It was the first physical link in 26 years. The arrest came before sunrise, quiet but decisive. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as officers led Mercer to a patrol car, his face pale, expression unreadable. The headline detonated across Albany by noon. 1977 cold case arrest. Community stunned. The name Daniel Mercer flashed across television screens, beneath Margaret's high school portrait that had never aged. Interrogation transcripts later described a man who alternated between indignation and eerie calm. He denied harming Margaret. He suggested someone planted the bracelet. He asked for a lawyer, then waived his right, then asked again. Hours passed. Detectives pressed on the inconsistencies in his statements, the gaps in his alibi, the history of complaints. And still, one question echoed louder than the rest. Where was Margaret? Without a body, without a confession, the case teetered between breakthrough and collapse. Prosecutors debated whether the bracelet and circumstantial evidence would withstand trial. The community, meanwhile, reeled. For decades, they had lived with a ghost story, a cautionary tale told to daughters walking home at night. Now they faced the possibility that the monster had been hiding in plain sight, fixing engines, shaking hands at parades, attending barbecues. The snow began to fall again that winter, blanketing the same stretch of road where a car once sat abandoned under a flickering light. People drove past more slowly now, glancing at the riverbank as if expecting it to answer back. The words "cold case closed" circulated in newspapers and whispered conversations, but closure felt fragile, conditional, dependent on truths not yet spoken. Because an arrest is not the same as an ending, and disbelief has a way of lingering long after the sirens fade. The arrest did not bring silence to Albany. It ignited it. The kind of silence that hums beneath every conversation, heavy and electric, as if the entire city is holding its breath. Daniel Mercer sat in a county holding cell, 72 years old, shoulders rounded, hair silver and thinning, the image of a grandfatherly mechanic who had spent decades under the hoods of other people's cars. Outside, camera crews lined the sidewalk. Microphones hovered. The phrase 1977 cold case pulsed across every screen in town, resurrecting a winter night most had tried to forget. Inside the interrogation room, the air was stale, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Mercer's hands trembled at first, then steadied. Detectives laid the bracelet on the metal table between them, sealed in plastic, initials MH glinting under the glare. They spoke in measured tones. They revisited the timeline. January 14th. Garage closed at 9:45 p.m. Margaret Hale, leaving a friend's house at 10:14 p.m. Her sedan found abandoned less than an hour later. A 3-mile radius that intersected Mercer's daily route home. He said he didn't remember that night. 1977 was a lifetime ago. Snowstorms blur together. Roads look the same. He insisted the bracelet was junk, nothing more. When pressed about the locked chest, he shrugged. "I lock everything," he muttered. Habit. But habits tell stories. Investigators dug into Mercer's past with renewed intensity. They interviewed former employees at his garage, now in their 60s and 70s, men who remembered long shifts and a boss who preferred to work alone after hours. One recalled Mercer taking in damaged vehicles late at night, insisting on handling them personally. Another described a temper that flared without warning, tools thrown, doors slammed, customers humiliated over minor disputes. None had suspected violence. None had imagined murder. Then a name surfaced again, Claire Donnelly. In 1976, she had filed a complaint stating Mercer followed her from a supermarket to her driveway, idling in his truck until she ran inside. At the time, police chalked it up to paranoia. Claire, now living in Florida, agreed to speak. Her voice over the phone was brittle but resolute. She remembered the truck. Faded blue, dented rear bumper. She remembered the way Mercer stared, unblinking, calculating. He liked to watch, she said. Like he was measuring something. Records confirmed Mercer owned a blue pickup in 1977. Forensics returned to Margaret's abandoned sedan with almost obsessive care. Technology had advanced yet again. Swabs taken decades earlier were retested using refined DNA amplification techniques. A partial male profile emerged from the underside of the driver's door handle. Weak, incomplete, but present. It did not match Mercer. Not fully. The lab cautioned against conclusions. The sample was degraded, possibly contaminated by years of handling before strict evidence protocols were common practice. Doubt seeped in. Prosecutors hesitated to file formal murder charges without stronger DNA confirmation or a body. The bracelet was compelling, yes. Fibers linking it to the sedan strengthened the narrative. But defense attorneys were already whispering about chain of custody errors, about evidence stored through decades of procedural evolution. They hinted at reasonable doubt like it was a lifeline. Meanwhile, the community fractured. Some residents rallied behind Margaret's family, calling the arrest long overdue. Others defended Mercer, citing church attendance, charity work, the fact that he had fixed their transmissions without overcharging. Letters to the editor flooded local newspapers. Innocent until proven guilty, some declared. Justice for Margaret, others demanded. Margaret's parents did not speak publicly at first. They had endured too many false dawns. Too many men labeled suspects, only to walk free. But when they finally stood before cameras, decades older than the last time they addressed the press, their grief felt undiminished. Her mother held up a photograph, the same one used in 1977 headlines. "We just want to know where she is," she said, voice trembling. "That's all. Tell us where she is." The search resumed. Detectives obtained a warrant to excavate Mercer's former properties. Over the years, he had owned 2 homes and leased a storage unit near the river. Ground-penetrating radar scanned backyards and concrete slabs. Cadaver dogs alerted twice on a patch of land behind his original garage, now abandoned and slated for demolition. Soil samples were taken. For days, the area was cordoned off with yellow tape, media helicopters circling overhead. They found animal bones, rusted scrap metal, nothing human. The storage unit yielded old engine parts, a broken snowblower, stacks of newspapers from the late 70s. One paper, dated January 15, 1977, bore a circled headline about Margaret's disappearance. Detectives stared at the inked circle, thick and deliberate. Mercer claimed he circled news that interested him. "Everyone was talking about it," he said. "Why wouldn't I read it?" Why indeed? As winter deepened, prosecutors made a calculated move. They charged Mercer with second-degree murder based on circumstantial evidence and the possession of Margaret's bracelet. It was a bold gamble. Without a body, they would need to construct a narrative so cohesive it left no room for alternative explanations. Pre-trial hearings drew crowds. Defense attorneys attacked the bracelet's discovery, questioning whether it could have been planted, whether Mercer's collection of trinkets was merely eccentricity. They pointed to the incomplete DNA profile that did not conclusively implicate him. They reminded jurors, future jurors, that memory erodes over decades, that witnesses misremember, that justice delayed can become justice distorted. Behind the scenes, detectives continued to press Mercer for information. They offered no formal deal, but the implication was clear: cooperate, and perhaps the story softens. Refuse, and face the full weight of a community's fury. In a late-night interrogation session weeks before trial, Mercer's composure cracked for the first time. He asked for water. His voice thinned. He spoke about loneliness in the 70s, about feeling invisible, about watching people who seemed to glide through life untouched by struggle. He never mentioned Margaret by name, but he described a girl who pulled over one night because her car made a strange noise. He said he offered to help. He said she got into his truck because it was warmer. The room went still. He stopped there, asked for his lawyer. The statement was ambiguous, not a confession, not even an admission of presence. But it aligned too closely with Keegan's theory about the folded coat, about Margaret stepping into another vehicle willingly for just a moment. Investigators raced to verify whether Margaret's sedan had experienced mechanical issues that night. Old service records showed she had complained of intermittent stalling weeks before her disappearance. The car had been serviced by Mercer's garage. The revelation hit like a shockwave. Receipts confirmed it. December 1976. Hail, M. Tune-up and carburetor adjustment. Mechanic listed, D. Mercer. For 26 years, the man who fixed her car had never been interviewed about her disappearance. The narrative sharpened. Prosecutors now argued that Mercer could have tampered with the vehicle, creating a minor issue that forced her to pull over later. It was speculative but plausible. The defense countered that thousands of customers passed through the garage. To suggest premeditated sabotage decades later was conjecture at best. As trial approached, tension in Albany felt palpable. Every grocery store aisle, every church pew carried murmurs of the same question. Did he do it? People revisited their memories of Mercer, searching for signs they might have missed. A glance held too long, a joke that fell off, a moment of unexplained absence. Margaret's name resurfaced in conversations among those who had been children in 1977. They remembered their parents locking doors earlier. They remembered curfews tightening. The cold case had shaped a generation's sense of safety, an invisible scar across the city's psyche. In court, the bracelet became centerpiece and symbol. Prosecutors held it up for jurors to see, describing how it was found hidden beneath a workbench, how fibers linked it to the car. They played portions of Mercer's late-night statement about a girl who got into his truck. They introduced the circled newspaper headline. Piece by piece, they built a story of opportunity, fixation, and calculated silence. The defense dismantled each element with surgical precision. The bracelet could have been acquired through countless innocent means. The fibers were common to that era's upholstery. The partial DNA did not match Mercer, and his vague reference to a girl was just that, vague. Weeks passed. Testimony piled up. Emotions frayed. And still, one void remained unfilled. Margaret herself. No body. No confirmed cause of death. No final resting place. Just absence. As closing arguments loomed, snow began to fall again over Albany, blanketing the courthouse steps in white. Reporters huddled in coats, broadcasting live updates beneath streetlights that flickered like they had on that January night decades earlier. The phrase "cold case closed" appeared in bold graphics behind them, yet it felt premature, almost defiant against uncertainty. Because closure is a fragile thing, easily shattered by a single unanswered question. And in a case built on memory, on artifacts, on a bracelet locked in darkness for 26 years, the line between justice and doubt was razor thin. Inside the jury room, 12 strangers prepared to decide whether disbelief would give way to conviction, or whether the cold case that haunted Albany since 1977 would slip back into shadow once more. The jury room door closed with a dull, final click, sealing 12 strangers inside with 26 years of silence. Outside, the hallway buzzed with low voices, the shuffle of reporters, the muted hum of cameras waiting for history to tip in one direction or the other. Snow pressed against the courthouse windows, soft and relentless, as if the winter of 1977 had returned to watch. Inside that room, photographs were spread across a long wooden table. Margaret Hale's smiling portrait, the image of her abandoned sedan under a street lamp, the gold bracelet, initials MH catching the light, Daniel Mercer's booking photo, eyes heavy, jaw set. The evidence was not overwhelming. It was not cinematic. It was fragments, objects, and words stretched thin across decades. The foreperson, a middle-aged accountant who had lived in Albany his entire life, cleared his throat and began the first vote. Hands lifted hesitantly. Guilty. Not guilty. Guilty. Not guilty. The split was immediate and stark. Doubt had seeped into the cracks of the prosecution story. The bracelet was powerful, yes, but it was also singular. One object in a locked chest. The fibers were consistent, not exclusive. The partial DNA profile did not belong to Mercer. at least not conclusively. The late-night statement about a girl was suggestive, but it stopped short of confession. Defense attorneys had repeated one phrase like a drumbeat: reasonable doubt. Hours turned into a full day. Jurors requested transcripts of Mercer's interrogation. They replayed the recording of his voice describing a young woman stepping into his truck because it was warmer. They paused at the moment his breathing changed, subtle but noticeable, when detectives mentioned the folded coat on the passenger seat of Margaret's car, a detail never made public in 1977. Mercer had flinched. The audio caught it, a shift in tone, a half-second of silence too long to ignore. How would he know about the coat? One juror asked. Another countered. Maybe he read it somewhere. Maybe it leaked. But it hadn't. Records showed the detail had remained buried in police files for decades. The debate sharpened. One juror, a retired nurse, spoke quietly but firmly. She had watched Mercer throughout the trial, had studied the way his eyes avoided Margaret's parents when they entered the courtroom each morning. "He's hiding something," she said. "You can see it." The accountant shook his head. "We're not here to read body language. We're here to weigh evidence." By the second night, exhaustion set in. Coffee cups multiplied. Voices rose, then fell. Some jurors began to shift, persuaded by the cumulative weight of small details. The service receipt from Mercer's garage weeks before the disappearance, the circled newspaper headline dated the day after, the bracelet hidden, not displayed, the history of following women, of watching. It wasn't one piece that convinced them. It was the pattern. On the third morning, the vote changed. Unanimous. When the courtroom reconvened, it was packed beyond capacity. Margaret's parents sat in the front row, hands clasped so tightly their knuckles blanched. Daniel Mercer stood beside his attorney, shoulders stooped but face composed, as if bracing against an impact long anticipated. The clerk asked the question. The foreperson answered. Guilty. The words seemed to reverberate against the high ceiling, echoing down corridors and out into the snow-covered streets of Albany. Gasps rippled through the room. Margaret's mother covered her mouth, a sound escaping somewhere between a sob and a breath. Mercer did not react immediately. Then, slowly, his jaw tightened. His eyes flickered, not to the jury, not to the judge, but to the bracelet displayed once more on the evidence screen. Sentencing followed weeks later. Second-degree murder. 25 years to life, though at 72, it was effectively a life sentence. The judge spoke of lost futures, of stolen decades, of a community forced to live with uncertainty for too long. Mercer listened without visible emotion. But conviction did not answer the question that mattered most. Where was Margaret? In the months after the verdict, pressure intensified. Detectives returned to Mercer with a different tone. The trial was over. Appeals would take years. If there was anything left to say, now was the time. If there was a location, a grave, a place along the Hudson where snow and river had concealed truth, this was the moment to reveal it. At first, Mercer refused. He maintained innocence publicly, filing notice of appeal, claiming the jury had been swayed by sentiment, not fact. Yet inside the prison walls, something shifted. A chaplain later described Mercer requesting late-night conversations, asking questions about forgiveness, about confession, about what it meant to carry secrets to the grave. He never spoke Margaret's name, but he circled it, the way he had circled that newspaper headline decades earlier. Then, in the spring of the following year, Mercer asked to speak with detectives again. They met in a small interview room inside the correctional facility. No cameras this time, just a recorder on the table and two aging investigators who had chased this case across half their careers. Mercer's hands were thinner now, veins raised beneath translucent skin. He stared at the tabletop for a long time before speaking. He said he remembered the cold. He remembered seeing Margaret's car pulled over with the hood slightly ajar. He insisted he had not sabotaged it, that the engine trouble was coincidence. He said he stopped to help because that's what mechanics do. He said she recognized him from the garage, trusted him enough to accept a ride while he looked at the engine later. She got in, he whispered. The room felt smaller. He described driving only a short distance, pulling onto a side road near the river. He said they argued about what he would not clarify. His voice grew strained. He claimed she panicked, tried to open the truck door while it was moving. He said he grabbed her arm. He said she hit her head. An accident. That was the word he used. Detectives pressed him. If it was an accident, why not call for help? Why hide the bracelet? Why lock it away? He closed his eyes. She wasn't breathing, he said. I didn't know what to do. What he described next was fragmented, halting. He spoke of the riverbank, of snow already beginning to fall, of dragging her body across frozen ground. He pointed vaguely to a stretch south of the original scene, near a bend in the Hudson where currents run deep. I left her there, he said. Search teams mobilized within days. Boats scanned the riverbed with sonar. Divers descended into murky water thick with decades of silt. They searched the shoreline, probing earth that had frozen and thawed countless times since 1977. They found nothing. Currents shift. Banks erode. Bodies move, decompose, vanish. The Hudson had swallowed secrets before. Skepticism flared. Had Mercer told the truth, or crafted a version of events designed to soften his image? A tragic accident instead of a calculated murder? Without remains, without physical confirmation of his account, doubt persisted like an undercurrent. Margaret's parents listened to the summary of his statement in a quiet room at the police station. Her father's shoulders sagged under the weight of it. Her mother asked only one question. Did he say he was sorry? Detectives hesitated. He had not. The appeal process moved forward, as expected. Defense attorneys argued that Mercer's post-conviction statement was coerced, unreliable, inconsistent. Prosecutors countered that it aligned with undisclosed details from 1977. Legal briefs stacked higher. Hearings were scheduled. The case, once stamped cold and forgotten, now burned hot in appellate courts. Albany lived in a strange in-between state. Officially, the cold case was closed. There had been an arrest, a trial, a conviction. Headlines declared resolution. Yet the river flowed on, silent and impenetrable, withholding the final proof. On the anniversary of Margaret's disappearance, residents gathered near the stretch of road where her sedan had once stood beneath that flickering street lamp. They lit candles. They stood in the snow, breath visible in the dark, listening to the wind move through bare branches. Some felt justice had been served. Others felt only the echo of unanswered questions. Because even with a guilty verdict, even with a man in prison, the image that refused to fade was the simplest one. A car door left open on a winter night, a folded coat on the passenger seat, and a young woman stepping into the cold, believing she would return in just a moment. She never did. And the river, vast and indifferent, kept the rest. The river did not give her back. Spring melted the last of the snow along the Hudson, exposing mudslick banks and tangled roots where divers had combed inch by inch, but the water remained mute, dark, impenetrable. Sonar scans mapped the riverbed in ghostly outlines, sunken branches, discarded metal, the skeletal remains of forgotten debris, but no trace of Margaret Hale surfaced. No bone. No fabric. No final confirmation. And so Albany found itself living with a verdict but without a body, with a confession that sounded like truth but felt like strategy. Daniel Mercer's appeal moved through the courts with slow, grinding precision. His attorneys argued that his prison statement was shaped by age, by pressure, by the psychological weight of a life sentence. They emphasized the lack of physical evidence tying him directly to Margaret's death. The partial DNA from the car door handle still did not match him conclusively. It lingered in the file like a splinter, small, irritating, unresolved. In the meantime, detectives revisited every corner of 1977 again, not because they doubted the conviction, but because unanswered questions have a way of infecting certainty. They re-examined Margaret's final day in microscopic detail. She had taught 2 classes that morning, met with a parent after school, stopped at a pharmacy at 5:42 p.m. The receipt still preserved. A clerk remembered her scarf, bright red against the gray January sky. At 7:30 p.m., She arrived at her friend Laura Bennett's apartment for dinner. They drank tea, graded papers, talked about an upcoming faculty meeting. Margaret left at 10:14 p.m., hugging Laura in the doorway, promising to call in the morning. Laura's testimony at trial had been steady but haunted. She described watching Margaret walk to her car, snow crunching under boots, taillights fading into the night. "If I had asked her to stay," she later told reporters, "if I had insisted, maybe." Regret is a relentless companion. Investigators also returned to Mercer's old garage, now condemned and scheduled for demolition. Before the wrecking ball swung, they performed one final sweep. Beneath layers of oil-stained concrete, they discovered an older foundation slab, evidence of renovations done in late 1977, months after Margaret disappeared. Permits showed Mercer had poured new concrete in the rear work area that summer, citing structural damage. Ground-penetrating radar had not revealed anomalies before, but technology had improved again. This time, subtle density differences appeared beneath the slab's edge. Excavation began cautiously, jackhammers biting into aged cement, dust clouding the air like a resurrection of the past. Workers uncovered disturbed soil, a pocket of earth that did not match surrounding composition. For a moment, the entire site seemed to hold its breath. They found fragments of cloth, faded, degraded, nearly indistinguishable. Forensic analysts transported them to the lab with reverence bordering on fear. Tests determined the fabric was synthetic, common in the 70s. Blue, consistent with the lining of a winter coat. Margaret's coat had been found folded neatly on the passenger seat of her car. The discovery cut both ways. If Mercer's confession about the river was true, why would there be fabric beneath his garage? Had he lied about the location? Or had he moved her body more than once? The possibility reopened doubt like a wound. Confronted again, Mercer's composure faltered. He insisted he had told detectives the truth about the river. He denied ever bringing Margaret to the garage after that night. When informed about the fabric, his face drained of color. "I don't know anything about that," he said. "You're trying to trap me." Forensic testing delivered another blow to certainty. The cloth fragments were too degraded for definitive identification. No DNA. No fibers linking them conclusively to Margaret. They could have belonged to anyone. They could have been discarded rags from the shop's decades of mechanical work. Albany watched the developments like a serialized drama, each revelation sparking fresh debate. Talk radio hosts dissected every detail. Some claimed Mercer had manipulated investigators with a partial truth, an accident story to reduce moral outrage, a river location to divert from a burial site closer to home. Others insisted the state was stretching coincidence into guilt, desperate to justify a high-profile conviction. Margaret's parents avoided the noise. They visited the riverbank alone one evening in early summer, standing where currents curved sharply south. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows over water that shimmered deceptively calm. Her father placed a single white rose on the surface. It drifted briefly, then spun away, swallowed by motion. "We just want her home," her mother whispered. The appellate hearing arrived months later. Mercer, thinner now, hair almost entirely white, sat quietly as lawyers argued over transcripts and evidentiary standards. The court reviewed the interrogation recordings, the bracelet discovery, the fiber analysis. They weighed whether the jury had been properly instructed on circumstantial evidence, whether Mercer's ambiguous statements had been presented fairly. Outside, the word cold case resurfaced in headlines once more, this time paired with appeal, uncertainty, legal battle. The ruling came in late autumn. The conviction was upheld. The court found no reversible error. The evidence, while circumstantial, had been sufficient. Mercer would remain in prison. For many, it felt like a second verdict, confirmation layered over the first. Yet even with the legal system reaffirming its stance, the absence of Margaret's remains continued to gnaw at the edges of closure. Years passed. Mercer's health declined. Reports from the correctional facility described a man increasingly withdrawn, prone to long silences. He declined further interviews. He never publicly expressed remorse. He never clarified the contradictions between the river and the garage. Then, in the winter of 2012, Daniel Mercer suffered a stroke. He was transported to a prison hospital wing, his speech partially impaired, his movements limited. Detectives debated whether to approach him one final time. Some argued it was futile. Others believed that proximity to death can loosen even the tightest secrets. They visited on a gray afternoon, snow drifting past narrow windows. Mercer lay propped against thin pillows, eyes dim but alert. A recorder sat on the bedside table, its red light blinking steadily. They asked him again, "Where is Margaret?" His lips moved slowly. Words came fractured, breathy. He repeated fragments of his earlier story, the car, the argument, the river. Then, unexpectedly, he added something new. "Not deep," he murmured. "Wasn't deep." The detectives leaned closer. "Water rose later," he continued, voice barely audible. "Spring flood. A flood." Records from 1977 confirmed unusually heavy spring rains that year. The Hudson had overflowed its banks in several areas, altering shorelines, eroding soil, shifting debris miles downstream. If Margaret's body had been placed near the edge, shallow and exposed, the rising water could have carried her far from the original site. It was plausible. It was maddening. Mercer closed his eyes after that, drifting into sleep or silence. They couldn't tell which. He never elaborated. He never described a specific landmark, a tree, a bend precise enough to narrow the search. Weeks later, he died. The news landed quietly at first, then spread with renewed intensity. The man convicted of Margaret Hale's murder was gone. Whatever secrets he held were sealed with him. Search efforts along the river resumed briefly, driven by his final words. Investigators expanded the radius, considering flood patterns from 1977, modeling current flows, consulting hydrologists about sediment displacement over decades. They recovered bones in scattered discoveries, animal remains, old burial sites predating the 20th century, but nothing tied to Margaret. Time continued its steady march. New generations in Albany learned the story as local history, a cautionary tale whispered by parents who remembered the fear firsthand. The phrase 1977 cold case became shorthand for endurance, for the idea that truth can surface even after decades, but also that some parts of truth may never be fully reclaimed. Margaret's house was eventually sold. Her parents passed away within years of each other, buried side by side. In her mother's belongings, relatives found the original box the bracelet had come in, empty and lined with velvet worn thin by decades of being opened and closed. The road where her car was found has changed little. The street lamp has been replaced, brighter now, steadier. Cars pass without slowing, drivers unaware of the history embedded in asphalt and frozen earth. Yet on certain winter nights, when snow falls thick and silent, long-time residents say they feel it, that old chill, that flicker of unease, as if the past is not entirely past. An arrest was made, a conviction secured, appeals exhausted. Officially, the cold case was closed. But somewhere beneath shifting currents, beneath layers of silt and time, the final piece remains missing. And in Albany, disbelief lingers, not just that a trusted mechanic could be a killer, not just that justice took 26 years to arrive, but that even now, with verdicts rendered and headlines archived, a young woman who stepped into the cold one January night still has not come home. Death did not silence the questions. If anything, Daniel Mercer's passing sharpened them. He was buried in a modest cemetery outside Albany, a small service attended by a handful of relatives who avoided cameras and refused comment. No protesters. No shouting. Just a gray sky and a casket lowered into frozen ground. The man convicted of ending Margaret Hale's life was now beneath the earth himself, taking with him whatever clarity he had withheld. But the case refused to settle. Months after Mercer's death, a new development surfaced, quiet at first, buried in a routine audit of old evidence. The partial DNA profile recovered years earlier from the driver's door handle of Margaret's sedan was re-entered into a national database using updated sequencing techniques. Laboratories had refined extraction methods yet again, capable of amplifying fragments once considered useless. This time, the result did not come back inconclusive. It came back with a partial match to a man named Richard Vale. Vale was not Daniel Mercer. He was not a mechanic. He was not even in Albany in 2003 when the arrest shook the city. He had died in 1999, 3 years before Mercer was ever charged. In 1977, he had been 32 years old, a traveling salesman with prior arrests for assault and attempted kidnapping in neighboring counties. Charges reduced, records scattered, largely forgotten. The DNA match was not perfect. It was familial. Vale's biological son, convicted of an unrelated offense years later, had his profile entered into the system. The algorithm flagged the connection, strong enough to suggest Richard Vale could not be excluded as the source of the male DNA found on Margaret's car door. The revelation detonated quietly inside the district attorney's office before spilling into public view. Investigators revisited the old files with renewed urgency. Richard Vale's travelogues from January 1977 placed him within 50 miles of Albany the week Margaret vanished. A motel receipt dated January 13th bore his name. Another, January 16th, showed him 2 counties south. Had he crossed paths with Margaret? Had he stopped on that same road? Had he touched her car? Or was the DNA the product of innocent contact, someone passing by, someone who tried to help, someone unconnected to the disappearance? The timing was devastating. Mercer was dead. The conviction stood. But now another name hovered over the case like a second shadow. The district attorney held a press conference under harsh lights and careful language. The conviction of Daniel Mercer, she emphasized, remained legally sound. The new DNA development did not exonerate him. It did not prove Richard Vale's involvement. It simply introduced a layer of complexity that demanded transparency. Albany reacted with a familiar mixture of shock and fatigue. Talk radio reignited. Editorials resurfaced old doubts. Was the wrong man convicted? Some demanded. Others insisted the bracelet, the confession, the service records, the circled newspaper headline, those pieces still pointed to Mercer. Detectives began reconstructing Vale's history. In 1975, a woman in Schenectady reported being forced into a van by a man matching his description. She escaped when he stopped for gas. Charges were reduced due to insufficient identification. In 1978, a college student in Utica accused Vale of stalking her for weeks. No arrest followed. Patterns emerged, isolated, disturbing, incomplete. The most unsettling detail came from an archived police report dated January 15, 1977, the day after Margaret disappeared. A state trooper had stopped Vale for a broken taillight on a highway just outside Albany. The report noted Vale appeared nervous, evasive. The trooper issued a warning and released him. There was no mention of Margaret. At that time, her disappearance had not yet been widely broadcast. Had Vale been in the area the very night she vanished? Investigators tracked down surviving relatives. Vale's ex-wife, now in her 70s, agreed to speak. Her memory was fragmented but chilling. She described mood swings, sudden road trips without explanation, a tendency to collect newspaper clippings about crimes involving young women. He liked the stories, she said. He'd read them over and over. Did he read about Margaret? There was no record of a circled headline in Vale's possessions, no bracelet hidden in a chest. But unlike Mercer, Vale had died before his home was ever searched in connection with the cold case. Forensic experts re-examined the DNA sample. It had been recovered from the exterior driver's door handle. That placement raised a critical question. Did it indicate the killer, or merely someone who had touched the car? In winter conditions, with snow falling and gloves common, transfer patterns could be unpredictable. The sample was small, partial, vulnerable to secondary contact. Still, the match could not be ignored. A task force was quietly assembled to evaluate the possibility that Margaret's case involved more than one man, or that Mercer had been wrongfully convicted. The bracelet remained central. Its discovery in Mercer's locked chest had been the trial's emotional fulcrum. If Vale had abducted Margaret, how did her bracelet end up in Mercer's possession? Coincidence strained credibility. Theft after the fact seemed unlikely. A frame-up across decades bordered on implausible. Unless the truth was Messier. Investigators entertained a theory few wanted to voice. What if Margaret encountered more than one predator that night? What if she had been approached first by one man, escaped, and later encountered another? The scenario felt convoluted, almost desperate. But cold cases have a way of defying linear logic. They also reanalyzed Mercer's prison statement. In it, he described Margaret stepping into his truck because she recognized him from the garage. He described an argument. He described her hitting her head. He described the river. He never mentioned another man. Yet his account contained subtle inconsistencies. He could not accurately describe the exact bend of the riverbank where he claimed to leave her. He misremembered the make of her car during one retelling. He insisted the water was shallow, though hydrological records suggested deeper currents even in winter. Were those the slips of an aging mind, or signs of fabrication? Public pressure mounted for an independent review. Margaret's extended family, now the ones carrying the torch of memory, issued a statement urging authorities to pursue every lead, no matter how late. The district attorney authorized the exhumation of Mercer's remains, not to test him, but to compare his DNA definitively against the sample from the car. The process was clinical, methodical, stripped of ceremony. Results returned weeks later. The partial DNA from the door handle did not match Daniel Mercer. It was not degraded coincidence. It was exclusion. The announcement reignited Albany like a reopened wound. Headlines shifted tone. New DNA cast doubt on 1977 cold case. Questions linger. Legally, the conviction remained intact. The bracelet, the fibers, the confession, those had persuaded a jury beyond reasonable doubt. But the absence of Mercer's DNA at the point of contact on the car complicated the narrative. Experts cautioned restraint. A killer might not leave DNA. Gloves, environmental degradation, secondary transfer, all plausible. The presence of Vale's partial DNA did not place him inside the vehicle, did not prove he abducted Margaret. It proved only that he touched the exterior door handle at some point. When? Under what circumstances? No one could say. Detectives turned their focus toward Vale's known associates, mapping his routes in January 1977, reviewing motel registries, gas receipts, credit card slips. They interviewed former colleagues who remembered him boasting about conquests on the road. One recalled a story Vale told about a girl who trusted the wrong guy on a snowy night. At the time, it sounded like crude fiction. Now, it sounded different. The river, meanwhile, flowed on. Search efforts expanded downstream, factoring in flood data from 1977 and sediment displacement models from the Army Corps of Engineers. The search zone widened by miles. Drones scanned riverbanks inaccessible decades earlier. Volunteers joined official crews, driven by a collective refusal to let Margaret remain only a name in a headline. No remains surfaced. The cold case, once declared closed, had cracked open again, not with a triumphant breakthrough, but with deeper uncertainty. Two men now cast shadows over a single winter night. One convicted and dead. The other long deceased, implicated only by a fragment of genetic code and a trail of troubling history. Albany wrestled with a disquieting possibility. Justice might have been partial, imperfect, or misdirected. The system had delivered a verdict, but truth is not always confined to courtrooms. On the stretch of road where Margaret's car had been found, drivers still pass beneath the steady glow of a modern street lamp. They see only pavement and river beyond. They do not see the layers beneath, the tire tracks swallowed by snow, the folded coat on a passenger seat, the invisible imprint of a hand on a door handle. Somewhere in that convergence of metal, ice, and human choice lies the answer. Whether it belongs to Mercer, to Vale, or to a version of events no one has yet imagined remains uncertain. And that uncertainty, more than any verdict or confession, is what keeps the 1977 cold case alive in Albany's collective memory, an echo that refuses to fade, a question suspended over the river that still has not given up its dead. The DNA revelation did something Albany thought it had already survived once. It reopened the night. For 26 years, the disappearance of Margaret Hale had been awound. Then the arrest of Daniel Mercer had stitched it shut, imperfectly, painfully, but shut nonetheless. The trial, the verdict, the prison sentence, they had allowed the city to breathe again. Now the air felt thin. Because the moment Richard Vale's name surfaced in connection with the DNA, every assumption built since 2003 began to tremble. Investigators returned to a question they had not seriously entertained before. What if Daniel Mercer wasn't alone in this story? Or worse, what if he wasn't involved at all? Inside the Albany Police Department, boxes of evidence that had already been opened 100 times were opened again. Old photographs were spread across tables under bright forensic lights. Grainy crime scene images from 1977 flickered across digital monitors. Margaret's car. Driver's door open. A dusting of snow on the windshield. And that folded coat on the passenger seat. The detail that had haunted the investigation from the beginning. Why fold a coat before stepping out into the freezing January night? The answer had always seemed obvious. She expected to be back in seconds. But now detectives wondered something else. Had someone else been standing beside the car when that coat was folded? Had Margaret already encountered a stranger before Mercer ever appeared in the story? The re-examination of evidence focused on one critical window of time, the 20 minutes between when Margaret left Laura Bennett's apartment and when her car was first spotted abandoned on the roadside. 20 minutes. That was all. The distance between Laura's apartment and Margaret's home was barely 12 minutes under normal driving conditions. Even accounting for icy roads, she should have been home well before 10:40 p.m. But she never arrived, which meant something interrupted her journey. Something sudden. Something close to that dark stretch of road beside the Hudson River. Investigators pulled archived weather reports from January 14, 1977. Snowfall had begun around 9:30 p.m., light but steady. By 10:30, visibility along rural highways would have been reduced. A stalled car. A stranger offering help. Those conditions created opportunities. But the timeline held another overlooked detail. At 10:32 p.m., a truck driver passing through the area reported seeing headlights parked along the shoulder of River Road. His original statement had described two vehicles. One was Margaret's sedan. The other, he said, was a dark van or panel truck. In 1977, investigators had dismissed the sighting as unreliable. Snow was falling. Visibility was poor. The driver had been on the road for hours. But now the description carried new weight. Richard Vale drove a van. Employment records from his sales company confirmed it, a dark blue panel van used for transporting product samples between cities. Detectives tracked down the retired truck driver who had made the report nearly 40 years earlier. He was in his 80s now, living in rural Pennsylvania, his memory fragile but stubborn. When shown the old statement he had signed, he nodded slowly. "Yeah, that was me," he said. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to pull images from the fog of decades. "I remember thinking it was odd," he continued. "A car and a van pulled over that late at night. Thought maybe someone had a breakdown." "Did he see anyone?" He hesitated. "I thought I saw a man standing between them," he said finally. That single sentence rippled through the investigation like a stone dropped in still water. A man standing between the vehicles. If the sighting was accurate, it meant Margaret had encountered someone before Mercer ever entered the narrative. Or perhaps Mercer was the man the driver saw. But Mercer never owned a van. And he insisted Margaret had gotten directly into his pickup truck. Two vehicles. Two men. The possibility hung in the air like static. Detectives dug deeper into Richard Vale's movements that week. His motel receipts placed him within driving distance of Albany, but they needed something more precise. Then they found it. A gas station logbook from a long-demolished service station outside Albany contained handwritten credit transactions from January 14, 1977. Among them, a charge signed by Richard Vale at 9:48 p.m. The location was only 15 minutes from River Road, which meant Vale could have easily been in the area when Margaret disappeared. But the mystery deepened further, because another witness surfaced, one who had never spoken to police before. Her name was Patricia Cullen. In 1977, she had been a college student driving home from a late study group. When news of Margaret's disappearance spread days later, Patricia had briefly considered calling authorities, but the details she remembered seemed trivial at the time. For decades later, after hearing about the new DNA evidence on the news, she decided to speak. Her memory was clear. She had been driving along River Road around 10:30 that night when she passed a van parked on the shoulder. A man was standing beside it. He was arguing with someone. She slowed slightly as she passed. For a split second, she saw a young woman standing near the open door of a car ahead of the van. The woman looked frightened. Then Patricia drove on. She told herself it was none of her business. "I still think about that moment," she told detectives, her voice breaking. "If I had stopped, if I had called someone." Investigators showed her a photograph of Richard Vale from the 1970s. Her reaction was immediate. "That looks like him." Not certainty, but recognition. The pieces of the puzzle were shifting again. If Patricia's memory was accurate, Margaret encountered Vale first, which raised a terrifying possibility. Perhaps Margaret's car had stalled, or perhaps Vale forced her to stop. Perhaps Mercer's later story about offering help was a partial truth layered over something darker. Or perhaps Mercer arrived at the scene after Vale had already fled. The theories multiplied, and with every new possibility, the original narrative of the case grew less stable. Because one fact remained brutally clear. The only physical evidence linking Margaret directly to Daniel Mercer was the bracelet hidden in his chest. A bracelet that should have been on her wrist when she vanished. How Mercer obtained it, if Vale had been the one interacting with Margaret that night, became the most troubling question of all. Did Mercer arrive after the confrontation? Did he find the abandoned car? Did he take the bracelet? Or had Margaret somehow ended up in Mercer's truck later that same night, crossing paths with two dangerous men within minutes? The coincidence felt almost impossible. Yet the evidence refused to settle into a simpler explanation. The cold case that once seemed solved was now spiraling into something far stranger than anyone expected. Two suspects. Two vehicles. Two conflicting versions of the same winter night. And somewhere between them, the last moments of Margaret Hale's life remained hidden in darkness. The Hudson River flowed past the old road as it always had, black water sliding silently through the valley. If Margaret had entered that river, the currents had long since carried her beyond the reach of certainty. But the truth about what happened on River Road that night was still out there. Buried not in water, but in memory, in forgotten witnesses, in tiny fragments of evidence waiting decades to be understood. And as detectives stared at the expanding timeline pinned across their investigation board, one realization became impossible to ignore. The story everyone believed about the Albany 1977 cold case might not just be incomplete. It might be wrong. The board inside the Albany Police Department's cold case unit no longer looked like the neat timeline that once led cleanly to Daniel Mercer. Now it was chaos. Photographs overlapped. Lines of red string crisscrossed between names, locations, witness statements. Margaret Hale's smiling portrait sat in the center, surrounded by fragments of a night that refused to settle into a single version of truth. Two vehicles. Two men. One missing woman. And 40 years of memory that might or might not still be reliable. Detectives began reconstructing the night of January 14th, 1977 minute by minute again, this time with Richard Vale inserted into the timeline like a ghost that had always been there but no one noticed. 9:48 p.m., Vale purchases gasoline 15 minutes outside Albany. 10:14 p.m., Margaret leaves Laura Bennett's apartment. 10:30 p.m., Patricia Cullen drives past River Road and sees a van and a car, a man arguing with a frightened young woman. 10:32 p.m., a truck driver reports headlights on the roadside, 2 vehicles present. After that, the timeline collapses into darkness. No confirmed sightings. No witnesses. Only Mercer's later confession, which now seemed both revealing and suspiciously incomplete. Investigators focused on the most disturbing possibility emerging from the new evidence. Margaret might have encountered Richard Vale first. Vale had a history: stalking, aggression, attempts to force women into vehicles. But unlike Mercer, Vale had never been tied to Margaret by physical evidence until the DNA on the car door surfaced decades later. That single genetic fragment now sat like a detonator inside the entire case. The question was simple but terrifying. Had Mercer stumbled into a crime Vale had already started? Or had both men participated in something neither of them ever fully admitted? Detectives turned their attention to Mercer's truck. In the original 1977 investigation, police briefly examined his pickup but found nothing conclusive. The technology of the era simply wasn't capable of detecting trace evidence buried deep in fabrics or seams. But the truck itself had not survived. Mercer sold it in 1981. It passed through 3 different owners before ending up in a rural junkyard outside Syracuse sometime in the early 1990s. For years, investigators assumed it had been crushed. But when a detective tracked down the junkyard's old inventory records, something unexpected appeared. The truck had never been destroyed. It had been dismantled. Certain parts sold. Others left rusting in storage. The search for those remnants became urgent. Within weeks, investigators located what remained of the vehicle's interior cabin: 2 doors, portions of the frame, and the original bench seat stored in a metal shed among hundreds of other discarded components. The fabric was brittle, dusty, sun-bleached from decades of neglect. But forensic science had changed dramatically since the 1970s. The seat was transported to a modern laboratory where technicians began the delicate process of extracting microscopic evidence from the foam padding and seams. They searched for fibers, hair, biological traces preserved by chance. Days passed. Then the first report arrived. Inside the passenger side seam of the bench seat, technicians found several long human hairs. Blonde. Margaret Hale had blonde hair. The strands were fragile but intact enough for mitochondrial DNA analysis. While mitochondrial DNA cannot identify a person with the same precision as nuclear DNA, it can confirm maternal lineage. Margaret's surviving relatives provided comparison samples. Weeks later, the result came back. The hair was consistent with Margaret Hale's maternal DNA line. For the first time, physical evidence placed Margaret inside Daniel Mercer's truck. The discovery shook the investigation again. Because if Margaret had been inside Mercer's vehicle, his story about giving her a ride might not have been entirely fabricated. But it still didn't explain Richard Vale's DNA on her car door, which meant the scenario detectives had begun to fear was growing more plausible. Margaret may have encountered Vale first, then Mercer. 2 separate men. 2 separate moments of danger. The implications were horrifying. Patricia Cullen was brought back for another interview after the hair evidence surfaced. Investigators wanted to revisit every detail she could remember from that night. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "I remember the girl stepping away from the van," she said. "She looked like she wanted to leave. Did she see another vehicle nearby?" Patricia hesitated. "There might have been another truck coming down the road," she said slowly. "I remember headlights behind me after I passed." Headlights. Possibly Mercer's. The theory began forming quietly among investigators. Margaret's car stalls, or is forced to stop. Richard Vale approaches. An argument begins. Margaret tries to leave. Then another vehicle arrives. Daniel Mercer's truck. What happens next remains unclear. But Margaret eventually enters Mercer's truck. Voluntarily? Or under pressure? Mercer's later confession described her stepping into his vehicle because she recognized him from the garage. But the hair evidence suggested she had been inside that truck, which meant Mercer had not lied about that part. Yet Mercer never mentioned another man, never described a van, never spoke about Vale. Why? One explanation seemed obvious. If Mercer arrived during an encounter between Vale and Margaret, he may have witnessed something he did not want to reveal. Or worse, he may have participated. Investigators re-examined Mercer's final prison statement where he described an argument in the truck and Margaret hitting her head. The language now sounded rehearsed, controlled, like a story designed to explain her death without admitting deliberate violence. But there was another chilling possibility. What if Mercer's story about an accident was true? What if Margaret was already terrified after encountering Vale and something went wrong once she got into Mercer's truck? A struggle, panic, a fatal injury. The truth might lie somewhere between predator and accident. But Mercer's death had sealed off the only direct account investigators had. Richard Vale had also died years earlier. Both men were gone, leaving only fragments behind. DNA, witness memories, old vehicles, and a missing body that could have resolved everything. Albany followed each development with growing unease. Residents who once believed the cold case had been solved now faced a far more unsettling narrative. Margaret Hale may have crossed paths with two dangerous men in the same 10-minute window. The statistical improbability of such an event did not make it impossible. Predators often operate in the same shadows, on isolated roads, late at night, searching for opportunity. If Margaret had stopped her car on River Road that night, she may have stepped directly into a corridor of danger. Detectives expanded their investigation into Richard Vale's past, hoping another case might reveal patterns linking him to Margaret. They didn't have to look far. In the spring of 1978, just over a year after Margaret vanished, a woman named Karen Whitfield reported a terrifying encounter on a rural highway near Utica. A man driving a van forced her car off the road. He approached, offering help. When she refused, he became aggressive, trying to pull her toward the van. She fought back and escaped. Karen later identified the man in a lineup: Richard Vale. The similarities to Margaret's situation were chilling. A roadside encounter. A van. A woman alone at night. Vale had been arrested, but the charges were reduced after inconsistencies in witness statements. The case faded. Until now. As investigators compared the timelines and patterns, a disturbing picture emerged. Richard Vale had the behavior. Daniel Mercer had the physical evidence. And Margaret Hale had vanished somewhere between them. The possibility that the Albany 1977 cold case involved two separate predators was no longer just speculation. It was becoming the most plausible explanation. Yet even that theory left one haunting question unanswered. If Mercer was not the man who first confronted Margaret on River Road, why did he end up with her bracelet? That small piece of jewelry remained the most powerful and disturbing artifact in the entire case. Locked in his chest for decades. Hidden. Protected. Like a trophy. Or like a reminder. And as detectives stared again at the evidence board filled with lines connecting Mercer, Vale, and Margaret Hale, one realization settled heavily in the room. The truth about that winter night was likely more complicated and more terrifying than the city of Albany had ever imagined. Because Margaret Hale may not have been taken by one man. She may have been caught between two. The years did not erase the street where it happened. The houses still stood in quiet rows along the aging blocks of Albany, their porches sagging slightly with time, their windows reflecting the same pale winter light that had shone down on that morning in 1977. Cars had changed. Families had moved. Children who once rode bicycles along the cracked sidewalks were now middle-aged adults with children of their own. But the story never left. People still lowered their voices when they spoke about it. The disappearance. The cold case. The girl who simply vanished. For decades, the case file had grown thick inside the archives of the Albany Police Department. Detectives came and went. Some retired. Some passed away. Each of them left behind handwritten notes, yellowing photographs, interview transcripts filled with circled names and scribbled question marks. And at the center of it all was still the same photograph. A teenage girl staring directly into the camera. Dark hair, quiet smile, a face that looked impossibly young. She had left her house on a cold afternoon in February 1977 and never returned. At first, it had looked like a routine missing person case. Teenagers ran away sometimes. Fights with parents. New boyfriends. Dreams of leaving small cities behind. But the hours stretched into days. Then days into weeks. And something about the silence began to feel wrong. Very wrong. Neighbors remembered small details that would haunt them later. A car idling near the corner. A man leaning against a telephone pole. A strange feeling that something had been watching the street that afternoon. At the time, none of it seemed important. But years later, every memory would matter. Every shadow. Every passing car. Every stranger who didn't belong. Detectives in 1977 began the investigation the only way they could. They walked door to door through the neighborhood, knocking on hundreds of doors across Albany's quiet residential blocks. Families answered nervously. Parents pulled children closer as police asked questions. Had anyone seen the girl after she left home? Did anyone notice a vehicle stopping along the street? Did anyone hear shouting? Screaming? Anything unusual? Most answers were the same. No. Nothing. Just an ordinary winter afternoon. But ordinary afternoons do not produce cold cases that haunt a city for half a century. The first crack in the silence came from a young boy who lived 3 houses down from the victim's home. He told detectives he had seen her walking toward the bus stop around 4 o'clock. She wore a light jacket despite the cold. Her backpack hung loosely from one shoulder. And she wasn't alone. Behind her, the boy said, a car rolled slowly along the curb. A dark sedan. The kind that blended easily into traffic. The boy remembered something else too. The passenger window had been lowered. A man inside had leaned slightly toward the girl as she walked. Not shouting. Not forcing. Just talking. It looked casual. Friendly even. Then the car moved forward. And the girl disappeared from sight. That single observation became the first real clue. Detectives immediately began searching for any vehicle matching the description. But in 1977, surveillance cameras did not exist on street corners. License plate readers were decades away from being invented. Tracking down a random sedan in a city the size of Albany was nearly impossible. Still, police tried. They checked DMV records, interviewed owners of similar vehicles, followed tips from nervous residents who reported suspicious drivers. But nothing led anywhere. The car remained a ghost. Weeks passed, then months. The girl's bedroom remained untouched inside her family home. Her clothes still hung in the closet. Her books remained stacked beside her bed. Her mother refused to move anything, because moving things meant accepting something no one was ready to accept, that she might never return. The case slowly shifted from a missing person investigation into something darker. A possible abduction. Then something darker still. A homicide with no body. And no suspect. The detectives assigned to the case began looking beyond the neighborhood. They examined known offenders across New York State. They reviewed records of violent crimes in nearby cities. They searched for patterns involving young women disappearing under similar circumstances. One name surfaced repeatedly. A man who had been questioned in multiple assaults during the 1970s. A drifter who moved through towns across upstate New York. Someone who had once lived briefly in Albany. But when investigators tracked him down, he had already moved again. And when they finally located him months later, the timeline no longer matched. Another dead end. Another empty lead. Inside police headquarters, the case file continued to grow. More interviews. More maps. More theories. Some detectives believed the girl had been abducted by someone she knew. Others believed it was a random predator passing through town. A few believed something even stranger. That she had willingly gotten into the car. That whoever spoke to her that afternoon was someone familiar. Someone she trusted enough to approach. If that theory was true, then the suspect wasn't a stranger at all. He was someone hiding in plain sight inside the community. The idea unsettled everyone. because it meant the person responsible might still be living in Albany, still walking those same streets, still shopping at the same grocery stores, still waving politely to neighbors who had no idea what secrets he carried. Years passed. The 1980s arrived. New detectives reopened the case. They reviewed every interview transcript from 1977. They re-interviewed witnesses, hoping memories might have sharpened with time. But memories rarely improve after decades. Faces blur. Voices fade. Certainty dissolves into doubt. Still, one detail from the original investigation kept resurfacing. The sedan. The quiet conversation through the open passenger window. And the strange calmness of the moment. It did not look like an abduction. It looked like a meeting. And that possibility terrified investigators more than anything else. Because if she had willingly approached that car, then the driver had earned her trust somehow. And trust takes time. Trust suggests familiarity. Trust suggests someone who had been watching her long before that winter afternoon. Someone who knew her routine, her schedule, her walk to the bus stop. Someone patient enough to wait for the perfect moment. Detectives began reviewing school records. Friends, teachers, neighbors, anyone who might have crossed paths with her regularly. They uncovered small fragments of information that had once seemed meaningless. A man who occasionally repaired houses nearby. A delivery driver who often parked along the same street. A mechanic who owned a sedan similar to the one described by the young witness. Each possibility was investigated. Each possibility collapsed. The years continued moving forward. The girl's parents grew older. Her mother kept the porch light on every night. Her father stopped answering questions from reporters. The case slowly faded from headlines. But it never disappeared. Inside the police archives, the thick file remained labeled with two words that haunted every detective who opened it. Cold case. And somewhere beyond those aging documents, the truth still waited quietly. Hidden in forgotten memories. Buried in overlooked evidence. Or locked inside the mind of someone who had never spoken. Because every cold case has one thing in common. Somewhere out there, someone knows exactly what happened. Time does something strange to a crime that never finds closure. It stretches the silence until the silence itself begins to feel like a presence. In Albany, that presence lingered for decades, drifting through neighborhoods and conversations like a shadow no one could quite outrun. People who had grown up hearing about the disappearance in 1977 were now adults. Some had moved away. Some had stayed. But the story never truly left the city. It lived in old newspaper clippings tucked inside kitchen drawers, in late-night conversations between neighbors, in the quiet unease that sometimes settled over the streets after dark. The case file inside the evidence room of the Albany Police Department had long ago turned brittle with age. Photographs curled slightly at the edges. Tape recordings of early interviews were stored on aging reels that crackled when played. Handwritten notes from detectives in the late 1970s showed coffee stains and fading ink. Yet every page still pointed back to the same moment in time, a winter afternoon, a quiet street, a teenage girl walking alone, and a dark sedan slowing beside her. For years, investigators had circled the same unanswered question. Who was in that car? The boy who had seen the vehicle rolling slowly behind the girl had long since grown up. By the time detectives returned to him again in the early 2000s, he was a middle-aged man with a family of his own. Yet the memory had never fully left him. When investigators asked him to close his eyes and picture the scene again, he did so carefully, slowly, as if reaching back through a thick fog of years. The street appeared in his mind exactly as it had been that day. Snow piled along the edges of the sidewalk. Bare branches rattling in the winter wind. The girl walking with her backpack slung over one shoulder. And then the car. Dark. Long quiet. He remembered the way it moved. Not racing, not creeping, but gliding slowly enough to stay beside her. And he remembered the man leaning slightly across the passenger seat, speaking through the open window. Detectives asked the question they had asked many times before. Did you see his face? The man shook his head slowly. Not clearly. Just a shape. A profile. A man maybe in his 30s or 40s. Dark hair. Nothing that stood out. Nothing helpful. But then the witness said something he had never said before. Something that made the detectives in the room sit a little straighter. The engine. Back in 1977, he had not paid attention to it.
It was just a car passing by.
But decades later, after years of driving his own vehicles and hearing the sounds of countless engines, he realized something about that memory. The sedan had not sounded new. It had a low, rough idle. The kind of sound older engines made when they had been driven for many years. It wasn't a new car. It was older. And that small detail, insignificant at first glance, changed the direction of the investigation. Because suddenly, detectives were not looking for just any sedan from the late 1970s. They were looking for something older, possibly from the 1960s or early 1970s. A car that had likely been owned for years by someone living nearby. Someone who knew the neighborhood well enough to drive through it slowly without attracting attention. Someone comfortable enough to stop and speak with a teenage girl walking alone. The idea circled back to the same unsettling theory that had haunted the case for decades. The driver might have been local. Very local. Detectives began combing through property records, employment logs, and vehicle registrations from the mid-1970s. It was painstaking work. Paper records had to be retrieved from storage facilities and archives. Some documents were incomplete. Others had been lost entirely over the years. But piece by piece, investigators rebuilt a picture of the neighborhood as it had existed in 1977. They mapped every household within a half-mile radius of the girl's home. They listed every adult male living in the area at the time. Then they cross-referenced those names with vehicle registrations from the same period. The result was a long list of potential owners of older sedans. Dozens of names. Too many to investigate easily. Yet among those names, one stood out. Not because of what it revealed, but because of what it hid. The man had lived only a few blocks from the girl's house in 1977. He had been in his late 30s at the time. Employed as a maintenance worker for a local warehouse. Quiet. Married. Known to neighbors as someone who kept mostly to himself. His vehicle registration showed ownership of a dark sedan manufactured in the late 1960s. A match, at least on paper, to the description given by the witness decades earlier. Yet his name had barely appeared in the original case file.
Why?
Detectives dug deeper. They found that in 1977, officers had briefly spoken with him during their early neighborhood canvass. He had answered a few basic questions. Said he had been home most of the afternoon. Said he had not noticed anything unusual. At the time, nothing about his answers had raised suspicion. And so investigators moved on. But looking back decades later, something about that brief encounter now seemed unsettlingly thin. Only a few lines of notes. No follow-up interview. No deeper investigation. Just another name crossed off the list. The man had lived in Albany for several more years after the disappearance. Then, sometime in the early 1980s, he moved away. His trail grew faint after that. Property records showed he relocated to another town in New York State. Later still, he appeared briefly in employment records in another state entirely. Then the paper trail stopped. No clear record of where he went. No clear record of when he died. Or if he was even dead at all. The detectives working the cold case exchanged quiet looks across the table. After all these years, they might finally have a lead. But a lead is not proof. Not in a case that old. To move forward, they needed something stronger than coincidence and speculation. Something that connected the man to the victim in a way that could survive scrutiny. Something physical. Something undeniable. They returned to the evidence collected back in 1977. A small plastic bag containing fibers found on the victim's clothing. Photographs of footprints taken near the bus stop. And a handful of items recovered from the area during the first days of the investigation. Back then, the technology simply didn't exist to analyze those materials in meaningful ways. But now, decades later, forensic science had changed everything. The detectives sent several pieces of evidence to a modern laboratory, hoping that the smallest trace might reveal something the investigators of 1977 could never have seen. And as the technicians began examining the evidence under powerful microscopes and advanced testing equipment, the past slowly began whispering again. Because time can bury a crime. But sometimes, hidden within the smallest fragments of evidence, the truth waits patiently for the moment when someone finally knows how to see it. The evidence locker inside the headquarters of the Albany Police Department had the stale smell of time itself. Metal shelves carried hundreds of boxes, cases solved, cases forgotten, cases that still whispered unanswered questions. Among them sat a thin cardboard container labeled with fading marker ink, 1977 missing, female, Albany. For decades, that box had remained almost untouched. Not because investigators didn't care, but because there was simply nothing left to do. In 1977, the detectives who first worked the disappearance had exhausted every lead they could see. They knocked on doors, interviewed neighbors, questioned acquaintances, tracked down vehicles, and searched fields and wooded areas outside Albany. But in the end, the trail went cold. And cold cases have a cruel way of settling into silence. But the silence didn't mean the story was finished. When modern investigators reopened the case decades later, they approached the evidence differently. They weren't just looking for fingerprints or eyewitness statements anymore. They were searching for microscopic traces, DNA fragments, fibers, particles invisible to the detectives of the 1970s. The technicians began with the simplest item in the box: a plastic bag containing fibers recovered from the girl's coat. Back in 1977, investigators had cataloged them carefully but had no way to analyze them meaningfully. They knew the fibers did not match the victim's clothing. They suspected they came from another source, possibly a vehicle interior, but that was where the trail had ended. Now, in a sterile laboratory filled with humming machines and glowing screens, scientists examined the fibers again. Under magnification, the strands revealed something new. They were not common cotton fibers. They were synthetic. Specifically, a type of nylon blend upholstery used in automobile interiors during the late 1960s and early 1970s. That detail alone did not identify a suspect, but it narrowed the field. Investigators began comparing the fibers against manufacturing records from major automobile companies. The process was slow and meticulous, requiring access to old technical documents and archived product catalogs. Weeks turned into months. Then one afternoon, a forensic analyst made a discovery that shifted the room's atmosphere instantly. The fiber pattern matched a specific upholstery style used in only a small range of vehicles manufactured between 1968 and 1972. A dark nylon weave used in certain sedan models. The same era of vehicle detectives had already begun focusing on because of the witness's description of the old sedan idling beside the victim. The pieces were beginning to align. Investigators returned to the name that had resurfaced during the recent re-examination of neighborhood records, the quiet maintenance worker who had lived only a few blocks from the victim's home in 1977. He had owned a dark sedan from the late 1960s. A vehicle that now looked increasingly similar to the one the witness remembered. Detectives began reconstructing the man's life. In the 1970s, he had lived quietly in Albany.
Married.
Employed steadily. No serious criminal record. No history that would have drawn attention from police. But when investigators expanded their search beyond the city, something unsettling began to appear. In two different towns where the man had lived later in life, police reports existed involving suspicious behavior. Nothing that led to charges. Nothing that resulted in arrests. But the reports described incidents involving young women who felt they were being followed by a man driving a dark sedan. In both cases, the driver had never been identified. The reports were separated by years. Different towns. Different victims. But the descriptions carried an eerie similarity. Middle-aged man.
Dark hair.
Driving slowly along residential streets. Watching. Waiting. The detectives exchanged quiet looks as the information surfaced. If the man had been responsible for the disappearance in 1977, it might not have been the only time he had stalked someone. Yet even with these troubling connections, investigators still lacked something essential: proof. Without a body, without a direct witness, without physical evidence tying the suspect to the crime scene, the case remained circumstantial. And circumstantial evidence rarely closes a case after nearly half a century. But the lab technicians were not finished examining the contents of that old cardboard box. There was one more item: a small piece of fabric collected from the roadside near the bus stop where the girl had last been seen. Back in 1977, detectives had believed it might have come from a passing vehicle or a discarded garment. They preserved it just in case. Now, the forensic team tested the fragment again. Not just for fibers, but for DNA. At first, the sample seemed too degraded to analyze. Decades of storage had weakened the genetic material. But with modern amplification techniques, scientists were sometimes able to extract profiles from even the faintest traces. The technicians worked carefully. Hours passed, then days. Finally, the lab produced a partial DNA profile. Not enough to identify a person directly, but enough to compare against national databases. The investigators submitted the profile. Then they waited. Days passed with no results. Then weeks. Until one morning, a message arrived from the database system. The DNA sample had produced a partial familial match. Not the suspect himself, but someone related to him. A distant relative whose DNA had been entered into the system years earlier following an unrelated criminal case. The name that appeared in the report led investigators straight back to the man whose name had begun resurfacing throughout the reopened investigation. The quiet neighbor from 1977. The owner of the dark sedan. The man who had moved away from Albany decades earlier. Suddenly the case that had sat dormant for nearly 50 years felt alive again. Detectives began searching for the suspect. But time had complicated everything. Records suggested he had moved multiple times across several states. Employment documents showed brief jobs here and there, each lasting only a few years. Eventually, the trail led to a small rural town hundreds of miles away. And there, investigators learned something that chilled them. The man was still alive. Older now, in his 80s. Living quietly in a modest home where neighbors described him as polite, reserved, almost invisible. A man who kept to himself. A man who rarely spoke about his past. When detectives from Albany prepared to travel and question him, the weight of nearly 50 years pressed heavily on the investigation. If the man truly had been responsible for the disappearance in 1977, then he had carried that secret through half a century of ordinary life. 50 years of silence. 50 years of neighbors who never suspected anything. And now, after all that time, the past was finally knocking on his door. Because cold cases have a strange way of refusing to stay buried. Even when decades pass. Even when witnesses fade. Even when memories dissolve. Sometimes the truth waits patiently in forgotten evidence, in overlooked names, in tiny fragments of DNA, until the day investigators finally return and ask the question that has echoed through generations. What really happened on that winter afternoon in 1977? And who had been waiting inside that quiet, dark sedan? The house stood at the end of a quiet road hundreds of miles from Albany, a modest structure with faded siding and a narrow gravel driveway that curved toward a sagging garage. Nothing about it suggested the kind of story that had haunted investigators for nearly half a century. A rusted mailbox leaned slightly to one side. Wind moved slowly through the bare branches of tall trees surrounding the property. The entire place carried the same stillness found in countless rural neighborhoods across the country. But inside one of the vehicles parked along the road, detectives from the Albany Police Department sat in silence, studying the house through the windshield. For them, the journey to this quiet place had taken decades. The man who lived there now was in his 80s. Age had softened the sharp lines of the face captured in the few surviving photographs from the 1970s. The dark hair had long since turned gray. His posture had grown slower, slightly hunched with time. To the neighbors who occasionally waved as they passed his driveway, he was simply another elderly resident who preferred a quiet life. But to the detectives watching from the car, he was something else entirely. He was the final unanswered question in a case that had refused to disappear. The investigators had spent weeks preparing for this moment. They had reviewed every surviving interview transcript from the original investigation in 1977. They studied the brief conversation officers had once had with the man during their door-to-door canvass in Albany. Just a few lines of notes written in fading ink. Male resident. Lives 3 blocks away. Owns older sedan. States he was home during the afternoon. No unusual observations. At the time, the officers had no reason to doubt him. Now, decades later, the same lines read differently. They read like a missed opportunity. The detectives stepped out of the car and walked slowly toward the house. Gravel crunched beneath their shoes. The cold air carried the faint smell of wood smoke drifting from somewhere nearby. One of the investigators knocked. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then footsteps moved slowly toward the door. When it opened, the man stood there quietly, his expression calm but curious. His eyes moved from one detective to the other, reading the badges displayed on their coats. Neither side spoke for a moment. Finally, one of the detectives introduced himself and mentioned the city of Albany. Something subtle shifted in the man's face. Not panic. Not anger. Just recognition. He stepped aside and allowed them inside. The living room was small and dimly lit. A single armchair faced an old television set. Framed photographs hung along the walls. Images of relatives, grandchildren perhaps, ordinary moments captured over the decades. The detective sat across from the man and began explaining why they had come. They spoke about the year 1977, about the neighborhood where he had once lived, about a teenage girl who had vanished on a winter afternoon. For several seconds the man simply listened. Then he nodded slowly. Yes, he remembered living in Albany back then. Yes, he remembered the neighborhood. But the disappearance? He said he barely remembered it. The detectives expected that answer. After all, nearly 50 years had passed. Many people who lived in the city at the time had long since forgotten the details. But the investigators were not there for casual memories. They began asking specific questions. About his job in 1977. About his daily routine. About the dark sedan he owned during that time. The man answered calmly. His voice was quiet but steady. Yes, he had owned a sedan. Yes, he drove it to work every day. Yes, he sometimes parked along neighborhood streets. Nothing unusual. Nothing suspicious. Just ordinary answers. But then the detectives placed a folder on the table between them. Inside were photographs, old evidence from the case file. Images of the street where the girl had last been seen. Pictures of the bus stop. And finally, a photograph of the girl herself. The man looked down at the image. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he sighed softly. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a different tone. He admitted that he did remember her. Not well. Just as a girl who walked through the neighborhood sometimes. Someone he might have seen while driving past. But that was all. The detectives listened carefully. Then they told him about the witness who had seen a dark sedan driving slowly beside the girl that afternoon. They told him about the fibers recovered from her coat, about the forensic analysis linking those fibers to upholstery used in vehicles like the one he had owned. And finally, they told him about the DNA. A partial profile recovered from evidence collected near the scene. A profile that pointed toward someone related to him. The room fell quiet. Outside, the wind brushed softly against the windows. The man sat back in his chair and stared at the floor. Minutes passed. The detectives waited. Because in cold cases, silence can sometimes say more than words. When the man finally spoke again, his voice sounded tired. He said he had lived a long life. He said people make mistakes. He said sometimes those mistakes follow them forever. But when the detectives asked the question that had hung over Albany since 1977, what happened to the girl? The man simply shook his head. He said he had nothing more to say. The interview ended not with a confession, but with a quiet refusal. The detectives left the house carrying more questions than answers. Legally, The case still lacked the certainty required to close it fully. The evidence was compelling, the connections disturbing, but without a body, without a full DNA match, and without an admission, the truth remained suspended in that gray space where many cold cases live. Yet when investigators returned to Albany, something had changed. For the first time in decades, the story felt close to resolution. The community that had once lived in fear of an unknown predator now faced a different possibility. That the man responsible might have been a quiet neighbor all along. Someone who waved politely while mowing his lawn. Someone who drove past the same bus stop where the girl had disappeared. Someone who carried the secret of that winter afternoon for nearly 50 years. Even now, the official file still bears the same label. Cold case. Unresolved. But in the streets of Albany, among the people who still remember the story, the silence feels different now. Because sometimes justice does not arrive in the form of a courtroom verdict. Sometimes it arrives slowly, piece by piece, through evidence that refuses to fade and investigators who refuse to forget. And somewhere between the fading memories of 1977 and the quiet house where an old man now lives, the truth remains, heavy, unfinished. And still waiting for the one voice that could finally explain what happened when a girl walked down a winter street and stepped into the shadow of a dark sedan never to be seen again. Winter returns to Albany every year the same way it did in 1977. Snow settles along the sidewalks. Wind drifts through the quiet residential streets. The sun fades early behind rows of modest houses where families switch on porch lights before evening settles in. For most residents, it is just another season. But for those who still remember the disappearance that shook the city decades ago, winter carries a different weight. Because winter was when the girl vanished. And winter was when the silence began. Inside the archives of the Albany Police Department, the case file now looks different than it did for most of its life. For years, it was a forgotten folder stacked among hundreds of unsolved investigations, its pages slowly aging in darkness. Now it sits on a separate shelf, reopened, expanded, filled with new forensic reports and fresh interview transcripts. But the label has not changed. Cold case. Even after detectives traveled hundreds of miles to confront the man they believed had been hiding in plain sight all those years, even after the fibers, the vehicle records, and the partial DNA link that quietly pointed in his direction, the case still sits suspended between suspicion and certainty. And that gray space is where the story lingers. When the detectives returned to Albany after the interview, they met again inside the same briefing room where they had spent months reconstructing the events of 1977. The room felt quieter than before. Everyone understood what the interview meant. They had reached the edge of the truth, but not quite through it. Legally, the evidence still fell short of what prosecutors needed. The suspect's age complicated matters further. Decades had passed. Witnesses had grown older. Some had died. Memories had faded into fragments that could no longer withstand the pressure of a courtroom. Yet the detectives could not ignore the weight of what they had uncovered. The man had lived only a few blocks from a girl in 1977. He had owned a dark sedan matching the witness description. Fibers from the victim's clothing matched upholstery used in vehicles like his. And the DNA evidence, faint, partial, but impossible to dismiss, pointed toward his family line. Individually, each piece was incomplete. Together, they formed something unsettling. A picture that many investigators quietly believed told the real story. But belief and proof are not the same thing. And so the case remained technically open. For the victim's family, the reopening of the investigation brought emotions that had not surfaced in decades. The girl's parents had once waited by the phone every night hoping for news. Years passed with nothing but rumors and fading hope. Eventually, the waiting stopped. But the absence never disappeared. When detectives informed the remaining family members about the new developments, the reaction was complicated. There was relief that investigators had not forgotten the case. Relief that someone had finally looked again at the evidence left behind in 1977. But there was also frustration. Because the answers were still incomplete. The question that had haunted their lives for nearly 50 years remained the same. Where was she? Without a body, the story had no final chapter. Somewhere out there, the truth about what happened after the girl stepped off that sidewalk still existed. A wooded area, an abandoned property, a place chosen carefully by someone who believed the secret would never be discovered. Investigators searched areas connected to the suspect's life during the late 1970s. Old work sites, rural roads he may have traveled, parcels of land he once visited. But decades had transformed the landscape. Buildings had been demolished. Fields had become neighborhoods. Forests had grown thick where empty land once stretched for miles. Time had hidden whatever evidence might have once been visible. And yet the case refused to fade away. Local reporters began revisiting the story again, publishing new articles about the investigation that had quietly returned from the past. Younger residents of Albany, people who had not even been born when the girl disappeared, read about the case for the first time. For them, the story felt unreal. A teenager vanishing from a neighborhood street. A mysterious car. A suspect who may have lived among the community all along. But for the older residents who remembered the winter of 1977, the story was painfully real. Some remembered the day police cars filled the neighborhood streets. Others remembered the posters with the girl's photograph taped to telephone poles. Many remembered the uneasy feeling that spread through the community afterward, the sense that something terrible had passed through their quiet city and left a permanent scar behind. Now, nearly half a century later, that scar had reopened. Detectives continued reviewing the case, hoping one final piece of evidence might surface. Advances in forensic technology continued to evolve. What seemed impossible today might become routine tomorrow. The partial DNA profile recovered from the old evidence still remained in national databases. If new genetic techniques improved further, investigators believed it might one day produce a stronger match. And if that happened, the fragile line between suspicion and proof could finally disappear. But until that day arrives, the case remains suspended in time. In the neighborhood where the girl once lived, the street looks ordinary to anyone passing through. Children ride bicycles during the summer. Cars move slowly through intersections. Houses stand quietly beneath trees that have grown much taller since 1977. Nothing about the street suggests the mystery that unfolded there, except for those who remember. They remember the afternoon when a teenage girl walked toward a bus stop and never came back. They remember the rumors about the dark sedan seen moving slowly beside her. And now they remember the name of the man investigators believe might have been sitting behind the wheel. A man who lived quietly among them. A man who carried the secret of that winter day through decades of ordinary life. Whether the truth will ever be spoken out loud remains uncertain. But the story itself has become part of Albany's history now, a reminder that some crimes refuse to stay buried no matter how much time passes. Because somewhere between the frozen sidewalks of 1977 and the quiet rural house, where an old man still sits in silence, the truth remains waiting. Waiting for the moment when the final piece of the puzzle emerges. Waiting for the day when a cold case finally becomes something else. Not a mystery, not a shadow, but an answer. Time does not move evenly after a crime like this. In the quiet neighborhoods of Albany, the decades passed in ordinary ways. Children growing up, houses changing owners, new businesses replacing old storefronts. But beneath that ordinary rhythm, the memory of the disappearance lingered like a faint echo. People who had lived through the winter of 1977 sometimes found themselves revisiting the story without warning. A passing car idling too slowly on a side street. A young girl walking alone at dusk. A fragment of memory returning when the air turned cold. The city moved forward, but the case never truly did. Inside the offices of the Albany Police Department, detectives continued their work long after the confrontation with the elderly suspect. The interview had not delivered a confession, yet it had changed the direction of the investigation in ways that could not be undone. For years, the case had existed in total darkness, a mystery with no clear suspect. Now, the investigators had a name, a timeline, a vehicle, and a fragile chain of evidence connecting one man to the moment the girl disappeared. The problem was that Fragile chains can break easily. Prosecutors reviewed the evidence carefully. They examined the fiber analysis, linking the victim's clothing to upholstery found in older sedans, like the one owned by the suspect. They studied the partial DNA profile that suggested a familial connection to him. They reviewed the witness account from the boy who had seen the dark sedan driving beside the girl on that winter afternoon. Individually, each element carried weight. Together, they told a story that seemed difficult to ignore. But the law demands more than a story. It demands certainty. And certainty is the rarest thing in cold cases that stretch across half a century. Still, detectives refused to let the investigation fade again. They returned to every fragment of information gathered during the early years of the case. Old witness statements were digitized. Interview recordings were restored and analyzed. New investigators, people who had not even been born when the girl disappeared, studied the case as if it had happened yesterday. Sometimes fresh eyes see details others overlook. And in one forgotten interview from the late 1970s, a detail surfaced that had barely drawn attention at the time. A woman who lived 2 streets away from the victim had once reported hearing a car door slam around the same time the girl was last seen walking toward the bus stop. The sound had come from the direction of a narrow alley that cut behind several houses. At the time, detectives dismissed the observation. In a residential neighborhood, car doors slam constantly. But now, with a renewed focus on the dark sedan, the detail felt different. Investigators returned to the alley. The location had changed over the years. Several houses had been renovated. Fences had been replaced. But the narrow passage still existed, running quietly behind the row of properties. Standing there, detectives realized something unsettling. If a vehicle had pulled into that alley in 1977, it would have been hidden from most of the surrounding street. Anyone standing near the bus stop could have been guided toward the vehicle and then moved out of sight within seconds. No witnesses. No struggle visible from the road. Just a quick disappearance. The possibility added another layer to the theory investigators had been building. The suspect who lived nearby would have known the alley well. He would have known which streets were quiet in the late afternoon. He would have known how to move through the neighborhood without attracting attention. But theories alone cannot close a case. Months passed as detectives continued searching for additional evidence that might strengthen the investigation. They contacted people who had known the suspect during the late 1970s. Some remembered him vaguely. Others described him as quiet, even shy. A man who rarely spoke about himself. But one former coworker from a warehouse where the suspect had worked briefly in the late 1970s remembered something unsettling. The man had once joked about how easy it would be for someone to disappear in a city. At the time, the remark seemed like dark humor. But decades later, remembering the words while speaking to investigators, the co-worker admitted the comment had always stayed with him. It felt strange. Out of place. Like a thought that slipped out accidentally. Still, it was not enough to prove anything. The suspect remained free, living quietly in his rural home far from Albany. Detectives continued monitoring the case, hoping that advancing forensic technology might eventually strengthen the DNA evidence recovered from the old fabric fragment. But even as the legal investigation moved slowly forward, something else began happening. The story itself returned to public conversation. Local journalists started revisiting the case, publishing long-form reports about the girl who vanished in 1977 and the suspect detectives now believed might have been responsible. Younger generations discovered the mystery through documentaries and podcasts exploring unsolved crimes. And with renewed attention came something investigators had not expected. New tips. People who had once dismissed small memories as unimportant began contacting police. A woman who had lived near the suspect in the early 1980s recalled seeing him washing the interior of his car late at night. Another person remembered the man driving slowly past a group of teenagers walking home from school. None of the tips solved the case, but they added weight to the growing sense that something had been hidden for a very long time. In Albany, the story continued to settle deeper into the city's collective memory. The street where the girl disappeared remained quiet, yet those who knew the history sometimes paused when passing the bus stop where she had last been seen. It looked ordinary. Too ordinary. But mysteries rarely leave visible marks on the places where they begin. They leave their marks on people. On families who spend decades wondering what happened. On detectives who refuse to stop searching. And on communities that carry the memory of a single unanswered question across generations. As the years continue moving forward, the investigation remains open. The evidence waits patiently inside police archives. The DNA profile remains stored in databases that grow larger every year. Somewhere, perhaps in a place no one has searched yet, the final piece of the story still exists. And until that piece is found, the winter of 1977 remains unfinished. A moment frozen in time. A teenage girl walking toward a bus stop beneath gray skies. A dark sedan slowing beside her. And a city that still waits, after nearly 50 years, for the truth that may finally explain how a quiet afternoon turned into one of Albany's most haunting cold cases.